Abram Leon, The Jewish Question. 1. The premises for a scientific study of Jewish history. The scientific study of Jewish history is yet to transcend the stage of idealist improvisation. Serious historians have boldly attacked the field of history as a whole in the spirit of Marx, and have in large measure conquered it for the materialist outlook. Jewish history, however, still remains the chosen land of the God-seekers of every variety. It is one of the few fields of history where idealist prejudices have succeeded in entrenching and maintaining themselves to so great an extent. How many oceans of ink have been spilled to celebrate the famous miracle of the Jew? What a strange spectacle are these men who have, in order to preserve the sacred trust of their faith, braved persecutions and martyrdom, exclaims Biederite. The preservation of the Jews is explained by all historians as the product of their devotion through the centuries to their religion or their nationality. Differences among these historians begin to appear only when it comes to defining the goal for which the Jews preserved themselves, the reason for their resistance to assimilation. Some, taking the religious point of view, speak of the sacred trust of their faith; others, like Dubno, defend the theory of attachment to the national idea. We must seek the causes for the historical phenomenon of the preservation of the Jewish people in their national spiritual strength, in their ethical basis, and in the monotheistic principle, says the General Encyclopedia, which contrives in this way to reconcile the various viewpoints among the idealist historians. But while it is possible to reconcile these idealist theories with one another, it is hopeless to try to find some ground for reconciling these same theories with the elementary rules of historical science. The latter must categorically reject the fundamental error of all idealist schools, which consists of putting under the hallmark of free will the cardinal question of Jewish history, namely, the preservation of Judaism. Only a study of the economic role played by the Jews can contribute to elucidating the causes for the miracle of the Jew. To study the evolution of this question is not exclusively of academic interest. Without a thorough study of Jewish history, it is difficult to understand the Jewish question in modern times. The plight of the Jews in the 20th century is intimately bound up with their historical past. Every social formation represents a stage in the social process. Being is only a moment in the process of becoming. In order to undertake an analysis of the Jewish question in its present phase of development, it is indispensable to know its historical roots. In the sphere of Jewish history, as in the sphere of universal history, Karl Marx's brilliant thought points the road to follow. We will not look for the secret of the Jew in his religion, but we will look for the secret of the religion in the real Jew. Marx thus puts the Jewish question back on its feet. We must not start with religion in order to explain Jewish history. On the contrary, the preservation of the Jewish religion or nationality can be explained only by the real Jew, that is to say, by the Jew in his economic and social role. The preservation of the Jews contains nothing of the miraculous. Judaism has survived not in spite of history, but by virtue of history. It is precisely by studying the historical function of Judaism that one is able to discover the secret of its survival in history. The struggles between Judaism and Christian society, under their respective religious guises, were in reality social struggles. We transmute the contradictions of the state with a specific religion, like Judaism, into the contradiction of the state with specific secular elements. The general pattern of Jewish history is presented, with various slight nuances, somewhat as follows according to the reigning idealist school: up to the destruction of Jerusalem, as late as the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, the Jewish nation was in no wise different from other normally constituted nations, such as the Roman or the Greek. The wars between the Romans and the Jews resulted in dispersing the Jewish nation to the four corners of the world. In the dispersion, the Jews fiercely resisted national and religious assimilation. Christianity found no more rabid adversaries in its path and despite all its efforts did not succeed in converting them. The fall of the Roman Empire increased the isolation of Judaism, which constituted the sole heterodox element after the complete triumph of Christianity in the West. The Jews of the diaspora, in the epoch of the barbarian invasions, did not at all constitute a homogeneous social group. On the contrary, agriculture, industry, commerce were widely prevalent among them. It was the continuous religious persecutions which forced them to entrench themselves increasingly in commerce and usury. The Crusades, by reason of the religious fanaticism they engendered, violently accelerated this evolution which transformed the Jews into usurers and ended in their confinement in ghettos. Of course, the hatred against the Jews was also fanned by the latter's economic role. But the historians attribute only a secondary importance to this factor. This condition of Judaism continued up to the French Revolution, which destroyed the barriers that religious oppression had raised against the Jews. Several important facts challenge the truth of this pattern. 1. The dispersal of the Jews does not at all date from the fall of Jerusalem. Several centuries before this event, the great majority of Jews were already spread over the four corners of the world. It is certain that well before the fall of Jerusalem, more than 3/4 of the Jews no longer lived in Palestine. For the great masses of Jews dispersed in the Greek Empire, and later in the Roman Empire, the Jewish kingdom of Palestine was of completely secondary importance. The tie with the mother country was manifested solely in religious pilgrimages to Jerusalem, which played a role similar to that of Mecca for the Muslims. Shortly before the fall of Jerusalem, King Agrippa said to the Jews, "There is no people upon the habitable earth which have not some portion of you among them." The diaspora was consequently not at all an accidental thing, a product of acts of violence. The fundamental reason for Jewish emigration must be sought in the geographic conditions of Palestine. The Jews in Palestine were the possessors of a mountainous country which at a certain time no longer sufficed for assuring its inhabitants as tolerable an existence as that among their neighbors. Such a people is driven to choose between brigandage and emigration. The Scots, for example, alternately engaged in each of these pursuits. The Jews, after numerous struggles with their neighbors, also took the second road. Peoples living under such conditions do not go to foreign countries as agriculturists. They go there rather in the role of mercenaries, like the Arcadians of antiquity, the Swiss in the Middle Ages, the Albanians in our day, or in the role of merchants, like the Jews, the Scots, and the Armenians. We see here that a similar environment tends to produce similar characteristics among peoples of different races. 2. The overwhelming majority of Jews of the diaspora unquestionably engaged in trade. Palestine itself since very remote times constituted a passageway for merchandise, a bridge between the valleys of the Euphrates and the Nile. Syria was the inevitable highway of the conquerors, trade and ideas followed the same route. It is easy to see that from a very early date these regions were thickly populated, and possessed great cities whose very situation lent itself to commerce. The geographic conditions of Palestine therefore explain both the Jewish emigration and its commercial character. On the other hand, among all nations, at the beginning of their development, the traders are foreigners. The characteristic of a natural economy is that each sphere produces everything consumed by it and consumes everything it produces. There is consequently no pressure to buy goods or services from others, because what is produced is consumed in this economy. We find among all these peoples that the first traders are foreigners. Philo enumerates many cities where the Jews were established as traders. He states that they inhabited countless cities in Europe, in Asia, in Libya, on the mainland and in the islands, along the coasts and in the interior. The Jews who inhabited the Hellenic islands, as well as the mainland and further to the west, had installed themselves there with commercial objectives. As well as the Syrians, the Jews were to be found in all the cities, living in small communities. They were sailors, brokers, bankers, whose influence was as essential in the economic life of the time as was the Oriental influence which made itself felt at the same time in the art and the religious thought of the period. It is to their social position that the Jews are beholden for the wide autonomy granted them by the Roman emperors. The Jews, and they only, were allowed to form, so to speak, a community within the community and, while the other non-burgesses were ruled by the authorities of the burgess body, they were permitted, up to a certain degree, to govern themselves. Caesar advanced the interests of the Jews in Alexandria and in Rome by special favors and privileges, and protected in particular their peculiar worship against the Roman as well as against the Greek local priests. 3. Hatred for the Jews does not date solely from the birth of Christianity. Seneca treated the Jews as a criminal race. Juvenal believed that the Jews existed only to cause evil for other peoples. Quintilian said that the Jews were a curse for other people. The cause of ancient anti-Semitism is the same as for medieval anti-Semitism, the antagonism toward the merchant in every society based principally on the production of use values. Medieval hostility toward merchants is not solely of Christian or pseudo-Christian inspiration. It also has a real pagan source. The latter was strongly rooted in a class ideology, in the disdain which the leading classes of Roman society, the senatorial gentes as well as the provincial curia, felt, out of a deep peasant tradition, toward all forms of economic activity other than those deriving from agriculture. However, while anti-Semitism was already strongly developed in Roman society, the condition of the Jews, as we have seen, was quite enviable there. The hostility of classes that lie from the land toward trade does not eliminate their dependence upon the latter. The landowner hates and despises the merchant, but he cannot get along without him.
The triumph of Christianity did not bring any notable changes in this regard. Christianity, at first the religion of the slaves and the downtrodden, was rapidly transformed into an ideology of the ruling class of landed proprietors. It was Constantine the Great who laid the foundation for medieval serfdom. The triumphal march of Christianity across Europe was accompanied by an extension of feudal economy. The religious orders played an extremely important role in the progress of civilization, which consisted in that epoch of developing agriculture on the basis of serfdom. There is little astonishing in the fact that born in Judaism, formed at first exclusively of Jews, Christianity nevertheless nowhere during the first 4 centuries found more difficulty than among them in acquiring partisans for its doctrine. As a matter of fact, Christian mentality during the first 10 centuries of our era viewed everything connected with economic life from the basic standpoint that a merchant can with difficulty do work pleasing to God and that all trade implies a greater or lesser amount of cheating. The life of the Jews appeared completely incomprehensible to Saint Ambrose, who lived in the 4th century. He despised the wealth of the Jews profoundly, and firmly believed that they would be punished for it by eternal damnation. The fierce hostility of the Jews toward Catholicism and their determination to preserve a religion which admirably expressed their social interests are therefore quite natural. It is not the loyalty of the Jews to their faith which explains their preservation as a distinct social group. On the contrary, it is their preservation as a distinct social group which explains their attachment to their faith. Nevertheless, like the hostility in antiquity toward the Jews, Christian anti-Semitism in the first 10 centuries of the Christian era never went to the extreme of demanding the annihilation of Judaism. Whereas official Christianity mercilessly persecuted paganism and heresies, it tolerated the Jewish religion. The condition of the Jews continued to improve during the decline of the Roman Empire, after the complete triumph of Christianity and up to the 12th century. The more economic decay deepened, all the more did the commercial role of the Jews grow in importance. In the 10th century, they constituted the sole economic link between Europe and Asia. 4. It is only from the 12th century on, parallel with the economic development of Western Europe, with the growth of cities and the formation of a native commercial and industrial class, that the condition of the Jews begins to worsen seriously, leading to their almost complete elimination from most of the Western countries. Persecutions of the Jews take on increasingly violent forms. As against this, in the backward countries of Eastern Europe, their condition continued to flourish up to a fairly recent period. From these few preliminary considerations, we can see how false is the general conception prevailing in the sphere of Jewish history. Above all, the Jews constitute historically a social group with a specific economic function. They are a class, or more precisely, a people class. The concept of class does not at all contradict the concept of people. It is because the Jews have preserved themselves as a social class that they have likewise retained certain of their religious, ethnic, and linguistic traits. This identification of a class with a people, or race, is far from being exceptional in pre-capitalist societies. Social classes were then frequently distinguished by a more or less national or racial character. The higher and lower classes are in many countries the lineal representatives of the peoples conquering and the peoples conquered of an anterior epoch. The race of the invaders formed a military nobility, the invaded race, not living by the sword but by the compulsory labor of their hands. Kautsky speaks in the same vein, different classes may assume the character of different races. On the other hand, the meeting of many races, each developing an occupation of its own, may lead to their taking up various callings or social positions within the same community. Race becomes class. There is evidently a continuous interdependence between racial or national and class characteristics. The social position of the Jews has had a profound, determining influence on their national character. There is no contradiction in this idea of a people class, and it is even easier to show the correspondence between class and religion. Whenever a class attains a certain degree of maturity in consciousness, its opposition to the ruling class takes on religious forms. The heresies of the Albigenses, the Lollards, the Manichaeans, the Cathari, and other innumerable sects that swarmed in medieval cities, were the initial religious manifestations of the growing opposition to the feudal order by the bourgeoisie and the people as a whole. These heresies nowhere reached the level of a dominant religion because of the relative weakness of the medieval bourgeoisie. They were savagely drowned in blood. It was only in the 17th century that the bourgeoisie, increasing in power, was able to bring about the triumph of Lutheranism and above all of Calvinism and its English equivalents. Whereas Catholicism expresses the interests of the landed nobility and of the feudal order, while Calvinism, or Puritanism, represents those of the bourgeoisie or capitalism. Judaism mirrors the interests of a pre-capitalist mercantile class. What primarily distinguishes Jewish capitalism from genuine capitalism is that, by contrast with the latter, it is not the bearer of a new mode of production. The merchant's capital is pure, separated from the extremes, the spheres of production, between which it intervenes. The trading nations of the ancients existed like the gods of Epicurus in the intermediate worlds of the universe, or rather like the Jews in the pores of Polish society. Both usury and commerce exploit the various modes of production. They do not create it, but attack it from the outside. The accumulation of money in the hands of the Jews did not arise from a special mode of production, from capitalist production. Surplus value, or surplus product, came from feudal exploitation, and the lords were obliged to yield part of this surplus value to the Jews. Hence the antagonism between the Jews and feudalism, but hence likewise came the indestructible bond between them. As for the lord, so too for the Jew, feudalism was Mother Earth. If the lord needed the Jew also had need of the lord. It is by reason of this social position that the Jews were nowhere able to rise to the role of a ruling class. In feudal economy, the role of a merchant class could only be a clearly subordinate one. Judaism could only remain a more or less tolerated cult. We have already seen that the Jews in antiquity had jurisdiction over their own community. The same was true in the Middle Ages. In the plastic society of the Middle Ages, each class of men lived according to its own customs, and under its special jurisdiction. Outside the judicial organization of the state, the church had its ecclesiastical courts, the nobility its feudal courts, and the peasants their manorial courts. The burghers in their turn, obtained their eshivans courts. The specific organization of the Jews was the Kehillah. Each cluster of Jews was organized into a community, Kehillah, which lived its own social life and had its own juridical organization. It was in Poland that this organization attained its highest degree of perfection. According to an ordinance issued by King Sigismund II in 1551, the Jews had the right to choose judges and rabbis whose duty it was to administer all their affairs. Only in actions between Jews and non-Jews did the voivoda courts intervene. Each Jewish community was free to choose a community council. The activities of this council, called Kahal, were very extensive. It collected taxes for the state, apportioned the general and special taxes, directed the elementary schools and high schools, yeshivot. It had jurisdiction over all questions concerning trade, artisanry, charity. It took care of settling conflicts between members of the community. The power of each Kahal extended to the Jewish inhabitants of surrounding villages. With time, the various councils of Jewish communities made a practice of assembling regionally at regular intervals to discuss administrative, juridical, and religious questions. These assemblies thus assumed the aspect of miniature parliaments. On the occasion of the Great Fair of Lublin, a sort of general parliament assembled in which the representatives of Great Poland, Little Poland, Podolia, and Bolhynia participated. This parliament was called Vot Arba Ratzith, or the Council of the Four Lands. Traditional Jewish historians have not failed to discern a form of national autonomy in this organization. In Old Poland, says Dubno, the Jews constituted a nation having autonomy, with its own internal administration, courts and a certain juridical independence. Clearly, it is a gross anachronism to speak of national autonomy in the 16th century. This epoch knew nothing of the national question. In feudal society, only the classes had their special jurisdictions. Jewish autonomy is to be explained by the specific social and economic position of the Jews and not at all by their nationality. Its linguistic evolution also reflects the specific social position of Judaism. Hebrew disappeared very early as a living language. The Jews everywhere adopted the languages of the peoples among whom they lived. But this linguistic adaptation generally occurred in the form of a new dialect in which we again find some Hebraic expressions. There existed at various times in history Judo-Arabic, Judo-Persian, Judo-Provençal, Judo-Portuguese, Judo-Spanish, and other dialects, including, of course, Judo-German, which has become present-day Yiddish. The dialect thus expresses the two contradictory tendencies which have characterized Jewish life: the tendency to integration in the surrounding society and the tendency to isolation, deriving from the socio-economic situation of Judaism. It is only where the Jews cease constituting a special social group that they become completely assimilated in the surrounding society. Assimilation is no new phenomenon in Jewish history, states the Zionist sociologist Rupin. In reality, While Jewish history is the history of the preservation of Judaism, it is at the same time the history of the assimilation of large sections of Judaism. In northern Africa, in pre-Islamic times, great numbers of Jews were engaged in agriculture, but of these, too, the vast majority have been absorbed by the local population. This assimilation is explained by the fact that the Jews, by turning agriculturists, ceased to constitute a separate class. Could they at all have taken to agriculture, they could hardly have done so without scattering through the country and its numerous villages, which, in spite of the difference in religion, would probably in a few generations have resulted in complete assimilation. Engaged in commerce and concentrated in towns, they formed agglomerations and developed a social life of their own, moving and marrying within their own community. Let us also recall the numerous conversions of Jewish landed proprietors in Germany in the 4th century, the complete disappearance of the Jewish warrior tribes of Arabia, the assimilation of the Jews in South America, in Suriname, etc. The law of assimilation might be formulated as follows: wherever the Jews cease to constitute a class, they lose, more or less rapidly, their ethnical, religious, and linguistic characteristics, they become assimilated. It is very hard to trace Jewish history in Europe at several important periods, because the economic, social, and political conditions were so different in various countries. Whereas Poland and the Ukraine were completely feudal at the end of the 18th century, in Western Europe we witness an accelerated development of capitalism during this same period. It is easy to understand that the situation of the Jews in Poland bore far more resemblance to the situation of the French Jews in the Carolingian era than to that of their coreligionists in Bordeaux or Paris. The Portuguese Jew of Bordeaux and the German Jew of Metz are two absolutely different beings, wrote a French Jew de Voltaire. The rich bourgeois Jews of France or Holland had virtually nothing in common with the Polish Jews who constituted a class in feudal society. Despite the marked differences in conditions and in the tempo of economic development of the various European countries inhabited by the Jews, a careful study permits the delineation of the following main stages of their history. 1. Pre-capitalist period. This was also the period of the greatest prosperity of the Jews. Commercial and usurious capital found great possibilities for expansion in feudal society. The Jews were protected by the kings and princes, and their relations with other classes were in general good. This situation lasted up to the 11th century in Western Europe. The Carolingian epoch, the culminating point of feudal development, was also the apex of Jewish prosperity. Feudal economy continued to dominate Eastern Europe till the end of the 18th century. And the center of Jewish life shifted more and more to that area. 2. Period of medieval capitalism. From the 11th century on, Western Europe entered a period of intensive economic development. The first stage of this evolution was characterized by the creation of a corporative industry and a native merchant bourgeoisie. The penetration of mercantile economy into the agricultural domain determined the second stage. The growth of cities and of a native merchant class brought with it the complete elimination of the Jews from commerce. They became usurers whose principal clientele consisted of the nobility and the kings. But the mercantile transformation of agricultural economy resulted in undermining these positions as well. The relative abundance of money enabled the nobility to throw off the yoke of the usurer. The Jews were driven from one country after another. Others became assimilated, being absorbed mainly by the native bourgeoisie. In certain cities, principally in Germany and in Italy, the Jews became primarily loan makers to the popular masses, the peasants, and the artisans. In this role as petty usurers exploiting the people, they were often the victims of bloody uprisings. In general, the period of medieval capitalism was that of the most violent Jewish persecutions. Jewish capital came into conflict with all classes of society. But the unevenness of economic development in the Western European countries operated to alter the forms of anti-Semitic struggles. In one country, it was the nobility which directed the struggle against the Jews, in others, it was the bourgeoisie, and in Germany, it was the people who unleashed the movement. Medieval capitalism was practically unknown in Eastern Europe. There was no separation between merchants' capital and usurious capital. In contrast to Western Europe, where Jew became synonymous with usurer, the Jews in Eastern Europe remained mainly traders and middlemen. Whereas the Jews were progressively eliminated from the countries of the West, they constantly strengthened their position in Eastern Europe. It was only in the 19th century that the development of capitalism, it is no longer corporative capitalism this time, but modern capitalism, which appears on the scene, began to undermine the prosperous condition of the Russian and Polish Jews. The poverty of the Jews in Russia dates only from the abolition of serfdom and of the feudal regime in rural property. So long as the former and the latter existed, the Jews found wide possibilities for subsisting as merchants and middlemen. 3. Period of manufacture and industrial capitalism. The capitalist period, properly speaking, began in the epoch of the Renaissance and manifested itself at first by a tremendous expansion of commerce and the growth of manufactures. To the extent that the Jews survived in Western Europe, and only a few were left there, they took part in the development of capitalism. But the theory of Zombert, who attributes a decisive activity to them in the development of capitalism, belongs to the sphere of fantasy. Precisely because the Jews represented a primitive capitalism, mercantile and usurious, the development of modern capitalism could only prove fatal to their social position. This fact does not at all exclude, far from it, the individual participation of the Jews in the creation of modern capitalism. But wherever the Jews were integrated into the capitalist class, there they were likewise assimilated. The Jew, as a great entrepreneur or shareholder of the Dutch or English India Company, was already on the threshold of baptism, a threshold, moreover, which he crossed with the greatest of ease. The progress of capitalism went hand in hand with the assimilation of the Jews in Western Europe. If Judaism did not completely disappear in the West, it was owing to the mass influx of Jews from Eastern Europe. The Jewish question, which is now posed on a world scale, therefore results primarily from the situation of Eastern Judaism. This situation is, in turn, a product of the lag in economic development of this part of the world. The special causes of Jewish emigration are thus linked with the general causes behind the emigration movement of the 19th century. The general emigration of the 19th century was caused in large measure by the failure of capitalist development to keep pace with the crumbling of feudal economy or manufacture economy. The ranks of the English peasants, evicted by the capitalization of rural economy, were swelled by the artisan or manufacturing workers displaced by machines. These peasant and artisan masses, eliminated by the new economic system, were driven to seek a livelihood across the ocean. But this situation was not indefinitely prolonged. Because of the rapid development of the productive forces in Western Europe, the section of the population deprived of its means of subsistence was presently able to find sufficient work in industry. That is the reason why, in Germany, for instance, immigration to America, which was very strong in the middle of the 19th century, dwindled almost completely toward the end of the century. The same applies to England and other countries of Western Europe. While the disequilibrium between the crumbling of feudalism and the development of capitalism was disappearing in Western Europe, it was growing worse in the backward Eastern European countries. The destruction of feudal economy and primitive forms of capitalism proceeded there much more rapidly than the development of modern capitalism. Increasingly greater masses of peasants and artisans had to seek their road of salvation in emigration. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was principally the English, the Irish, the Germans, and the Scandinavians who formed the bulk of immigrants to America. The Slavic and Jewish element became dominant toward the end of the 19th century among the masses streaming to the New World. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Jewish masses sought new roads of immigration. But at first it was toward the interior of Russia and Germany that they headed. The Jews succeeded in penetrating the great industrial and commercial centers where they played an important role as merchants and industrialists. Here we come upon a new and important fact. For the first time in centuries a Jewish proletariat was born. The people class began to differentiate socially. The Jewish proletariat, however, remained concentrated mainly in the sector of consumer goods industry. It was primarily of the artisan type. In the same measure as large-scale industry expanded its field of exploitation, the artisan branches of economy declined. The workshop was superseded by the factory. And it thus turned out that the integration of Jews into capitalist economy still remained extremely precarious. It was not alone the pre-capitalist merchant who was forced to emigrate, but also the Jewish artisan worker. Jewish masses streamed in ever larger numbers from Eastern Europe to the West and to America. The solution of the Jewish question, that is to say, the complete absorption of the Jews into economic life, thus became a world problem. 4. The decline of capitalism. By socially differentiating Judaism, by integrating the latter into economic life, and by emigration, capitalism has laid the basis for the solution of the Jewish problem. But capitalism has failed to solve it. On the contrary, the fearsome crisis of the capitalist regime in the 20th century has aggravated the plight of the Jews to an unparalleled degree. The Jews, driven from their economic positions under feudalism, could not be integrated into a capitalist economy in utter decay. In its convulsions, capitalism casts out even those Jewish elements which it has not yet completely assimilated. Everywhere is rife the savage anti-Semitism of the middle classes, who are being choked to death under the weight of capitalist contradictions. Big capital exploits this elemental anti-Semitism of the petty bourgeoisie in order to mobilize the masses around the banner of racism. The Jews are being strangled between the jaws of two systems, feudalism and capitalism, each feeding the rottenness of the other. 2. From antiquity to the Carolingian epoch, the period of commercial prosperity of the Jews. Before the Roman conquest. From a very remote time, Syria and Palestine were the highways for the exchange of goods between the two oldest centers of culture of the ancient Mediterranean world, Egypt and Assyria. The essentially commercial character of the Phoenicians and Canaanites was a product of the geographical and historical situation of the countries which they inhabited. The Phoenicians became the first great commercial people of antiquity because they were located between the first two great centers of civilization. It was Assyrian and Egyptian goods which at first constituted the main object of Phoenician trade. The same was certainly true for the Palestinian merchants. According to Herodotus, Assyrian goods were the most ancient and most important articles of Phoenician commerce. No less ancient, however, was the connection of the Phoenicians with Egypt. The legends of biblical Canaan, as well as Phoenician myths, reveal continuous relations by land and by sea, between the inhabitants of these countries and the Egyptians. Herodotus also speaks of Egyptian goods which the Phoenicians had been bringing to Greece from very remote times. But if the geographical situation of Palestine was as favorable as that of Phoenicia for mercantile trade between Egypt and Assyria, the facilities for navigation at the disposal of Syria were completely lacking in Palestine. Phoenicia was abundantly provided with everything necessary for sea travel. The cedar and cypress of Lebanon furnished it with timber. Copper and iron were also plentiful in the mountains of Lebanon and in the outskirts. On the Phoenician coast, many natural ports were available for navigation. It is therefore not surprising that at a very early date Phoenician ships, heavily laden with Egyptian and Assyrian products, should have begun to ply the navigable routes of the ancient world. The political and mercantile relations of Phoenicia with the great states of the Nile and the Euphrates, relations established more than 2,000 years before Christ, permitted the expansion of Phoenician trade to the coastal countries of the Indian Ocean. The Phoenicians brought the most diversified peoples and civilizations of antiquity closer together. For many centuries the Phoenicians maintained a monopoly of trade between the relatively developed countries of the East and the less civilized countries of the West. In the era of the commercial hegemony of the Phoenicians, the islands in the western Mediterranean and the countries bordering it were economically still very backward. This does not mean that trade was unknown to the society of the day, Homeric society, but for the Greeks it consisted essentially of importations. In payment for these purchases, for the raw or precious materials, the manufactured goods, which the foreign navigators came to offer them, the Greeks seem to have given chiefly cattle. This situation, so highly disadvantageous for the natives, was not long maintained. Phoenician commerce itself became one of the principal stimulants for the economic development of Greece. The rise of Greece was also favored by Hellenic colonization, which expanded greatly between the 9th and 7th century before Christ. The Greek colonists spread in all directions over the Mediterranean. Greek cities multiplied. Thucydides and Plato attribute the Greek emigration to the shortage of land. The development of Greek colonization was accompanied by a tremendous rise, at least for that era, in Hellenic industry and commerce. This economic development of Greece inevitably brought about the commercial decline of Phoenicia. In the past, the Phoenicians had landed their goods at the Greek anchorages and had exchanged them against native products, usually, it seems, cattle. Henceforward, the Greek mariners would themselves go to Egypt, to Syria, to Asia Minor, and among the peoples of Europe, the civilized Etruscans, and the barbaric Scythians, Gauls, Ligurians, and Iberians, taking with them manufactured goods and works of art, tissues, weapons, jewelry and painted vases, which had a great reputation and were eagerly bought by all the barbarians. The period extending from the 6th to the 4th century appears to have been the era of the economic apogee of Greece. The characteristic of this new period was that the professions had become more numerous, organized and specialized. The division of labor had been greatly developed. At the time of the Peloponnesian War, Hipponikos employed 600 slaves and Nicias 1,000 in the mines. This important economic development of Greece has stimulated most bourgeois scholars to speak about a Greek capitalism. They go so far as to compare Hellenic industry and trade with the vast economic movement of the modern industrial era. In reality, agriculture continued to be the economic foundation of Greece and its colonies. The Greek colony was not a trading colony, it was practically invariably military and agricultural. Thus, Strabo relates apropos of Cumes, a Greek colony in Italy, that it was not until 300 years after settling there that the inhabitants noticed that their city was located near the sea. The essentially agricultural character of the economic life of the Hellenic world is incontestable. Nor can there be any question of an industry comparable to modern industry. The methods of production and of organization remained on the artisan level. Only the mines seem to have presented, at least insofar as labor power is concerned, a picture similar to that which we see at the present time. The fact that despite their great expansion, industry and commerce remained for the most part in the hands of metics, of foreigners, proves best their relatively subordinate role in Greek economy. In the immense trade of which Athens is the center, as well as in its industry, the metics play a preponderant role. At Delos, the great commercial center, the inscriptions show that almost all the traders were foreigners. The Greek citizen despised trade and industry, he was primarily the landed proprietor. Aristotle, like Plato, was opposed to granting citizenship to merchants. It is therefore necessary to guard against exaggerating the importance of the industrial and commercial development of Greece. In fact, Greek expansion was primarily agricultural and military. It did, however, go hand in hand with an industrial and commercial development of considerable importance for its time. The Greeks never became a commercial people like the Phoenicians and the Jews, but we do find a very important commercial and industrial development in the Greek colonies and later in the Hellenic kingdoms. And, of course, the Greek states, while not really mercantile, supported commerce and industry with all their might as financial sources of the utmost importance. It is not solely to the economic development of Greece and its colonies that we must attribute the decline of Phoenician commerce, there was still another important cause, the growing antagonism between Persia and Greece. Paralleling the extension of Hellenic civilization was the victorious march of the Persians across Asia. The Persian Empire reached its apogee in the 5th century BC and extended over a part of Asia and over Egypt. The parallel development of Greek and Persian civilization necessarily dealt a mortal blow to Phoenician commerce. Trade between Asia and Europe was certainly rendered very difficult by the division of the Mediterranean world between two mutually hostile societies. The Persian and Greek worlds each created its own commercial trade. With the decline of Phoenicia and the development of Asiatic trade after the period of the Persian conquests, we can assume that Palestine, previously completely supplanted by Phoenicia, again began to play an important commercial role. The passageway between Egypt and Babylonia recovered all its value. Whereas Phoenician trade lost more and more of its ancient importance up to the point where, in the time of Lucian, salted products were the main cargo, the Jews played a leading role in the Persian Empire. Certain historians attribute an important role to the Babylonian exile in the transformation of the Jews into a commercial people. In Babylonia, the Jews became transformed into a commercial people, such as we know them in the economic history of the world. They found highly developed economic relations among the Babylonians. Recently uncovered cuneiform texts show that the exiled Jews participated actively in commercial life. They were involved in credit business, highly developed among the Babylonians. They were also big traders. But the dispersion of the Jews is certainly prior to the Babylonian exile. There are serious reasons for conceding the existence of a pre-exile diaspora. The scope of the Jewish exile under Nebuchadnezzar is very greatly exaggerated. Only a part of the ruling classes was hit by the measures of the Babylonian king. The majority of the Jews established in Palestine continued to live there. Consequently, if during the Persian epoch the Jews were to be found spread over all parts of that enormous empire, and the Book of Esther is very eloquent on this subject, it would be childish to view this fact as a consequence of the Babylonian exile, an exile which lasted altogether some 50 years. It is equally puerile to believe that the Jewish people returned to Palestine in the period of Ezra and Nehemiah. Their work was primarily of a religious character. It was a matter of rebuilding the temple and of reconstructing a religious metropolis for dispersed Judaism. Most historians have considerably exaggerated the role of Palestinian Judaism in the Persian epoch. They reason as if Jerusalem, once restored, all the history of Israel became concentrated around the Holy Mountain, as if all the people had really returned from exile and had lived on a land measuring some few hundred square kilometers in Tekoa, Mitzpah, and Jericho. In reality, in this epoch, the Jews of Judea represented only a part, and the smallest, of Judaism. and undoubtedly it was the least vital part. The Edict of Cyrus is addressed to the Jews of the diaspora in the following words: "And whosoever is left, in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of his place help, those who are going to Palestine, with silver, and with gold, and with goods, and with beasts, besides the freewill offering for the house of God which is in Jerusalem." Book of Ezra 1:4. "And all they that were round about them," continues the book of Ezra, 1:6, "strengthened their hands, the 42,000 Jews who were returning to Palestine, with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, and with beasts." It is obvious that we are not dealing here with the mass return of the Jews to Palestine but primarily with the reconstruction of the temple. During the Persian epoch, the principal colonies of the diaspora were situated in Mesopotamia, in Chaldea, and in Egypt. The documents which have been found at Elephantine in Egypt, dating from the 5th century before Christ, throw an interesting light on the condition of the Jewish colonies of the diaspora in this epoch. According to the archives belonging to a Jewish family, it appears that the Jews engaged in trade, bought and sold houses and land, loaned money, acted as depositories, and were well versed in matters of law. It is very interesting to note that even the songs and chronicles are in Aramaic, which shows that as early as the 5th century BC Hebrew was no longer a customary language for the Jews. Aramaic was the great Asiatic language of the period, the commercial language. The religion of the Jews of Elephantine was not as developed as the official religion codified during the Ezra-Nehemiah era. In a petition to the Persian governor, they asked for authorization to rebuild their temple. But the reform of Ezra-Nehemiah was aimed precisely at concentrating all the Jews of the diaspora around the single temple of Jerusalem. And it was in fact to Jerusalem that the gifts of the Jews dispersed throughout the world continued to flow up to the year 70. It was this wealth of the Temple of Jerusalem that was probably the principal reason for the offensive of Antiochus against the Jews. Simon advised him that the public treasury at Jerusalem was full of large sums and that there were enormous public riches. Second Book of the Maccabees, 111:6. Later, on the little island of Kos, Mithridates confiscated 800 talents that were destined for the Temple of Jerusalem. In the Roman era, Cicero complained in his speeches of the immense sums which were flowing into Jerusalem. The Hellenistic period constitutes the epoch of the economic apogee of antiquity. The conquests of Alexander destroyed the barriers between the Hellenic world and Asia and Egypt. Cities sprang up like mushrooms in all parts of the Hellenic Empire. The greatest founders of cities, not alone of this epoch but even in all history, were Seleucus I and his son Antiochus I. The Hellenistic kings created new urban centers destined to supplant the old Phoenician and Persian cities. On the coast of Syria, the port of Antioch causes the old cities of Tyre and Sidon to be forgotten. Seleucus creates Seleucia on the banks of the Tigris in order to rob Babylonia of its central role in world commerce. This goal was completely attained. Whereas Babylonia fell into decline, Hellenic Seleucia probably became the greatest city of this epoch. According to Pliny, it had 600,000 inhabitants. Alongside of Seleucia, Alexandria and Antioch became the centers of the Hellenistic world. All of these cities experienced an unchallenged prosperity during the Hellenistic period. The situation of the Jews appears to have been further strengthened after the conquests of Alexander. It appears that they were able to secure special privileges equally well, both from the Seleucidae and from the Lagidae. At Alexandria, to which they had been attracted by Ptolemy I and where they abounded, they formed a separate community which governed itself and was not subject to the jurisdiction of the Greek courts. The Jews enjoyed a certain autonomy and a privileged position in Antioch, the capital of Syria. This was also true at Cyrene. The privileged position and the specific economic roles of the Jews had already become the source of serious conflicts with the population of the cities which they inhabited. Struggles broke out continuously in Alexandria, Seleucia, Cyrene, and Cyprus, as well as in the Palestinian cities. These conflicts had nothing in common with present-day national antagonisms. On the contrary, the Hellenistic empires witnessed a tremendous assimilation of their component peoples. The name Greek ceased after a while to be applied to the members of a particular nation but was assigned to the ruling and cultured sections of the population. Alexander ordered everybody, an ancient writer tells us, to consider the world as his fatherland, the well-to-do as his kin, and evildoers as foreigners. The increased importance of Judaism in the commercial life of the Hellenistic world must also be attributed to the displacement of economic life toward the east. The prosperity of Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia offers a striking contrast to the poverty and decay into which Greece has fallen in the same period. Polybius repeatedly stresses the decline of Greek cities. Somewhat later, in the 2nd century, Visitors could hardly believe that this city, where water was scarce, the streets badly laid out, the houses uncomfortable, was the famous Athens. Athens was shorn of its role as center of the civilized world. What contributed to the ruin of Greece, together with her economic decline, was the ceaseless class struggles, which by virtue of the backward mode of production, could bring about no important changes. The victory of the plebeian was ephemeral, the redistribution of wealth could only wind up in new social inequalities, breeding centers of new social conflicts. Thus the triumph of Greece, after the conquests of Alexander, proved illusory. The displacement of the economic center of the world toward the east, which followed the conquests, brought about the rapid decline of Greece. The propertied and aristocratic classes, powerless before the plebeian revolts, had to seek support from Rome, but the latter could only answer by dealing the final blow to Greece as well as to Hellenism. The Romans threw themselves on the Hellenistic world as on a convenient prey to be pillaged and conquered. Between 211 and 208, according to the assuredly very incomplete information which has come down to us, 5 old cities of the Hellenes were sacked. Corinth, the rich commercial city, was destroyed. I was there, recounts Polybius. I saw pictures trampled underfoot, and soldiers sitting on them while throwing dice. Rome also dealt very harsh blows to Hellenism in Asia. Under the combined blows of the Romans and the Parthians, the magnificent structure of Greece was destroyed. Be Roman imperialism in its decline. In contrast to modern imperialism, which is based essentially on the development of the productive forces, ancient imperialism was founded on the looting of conquered countries. For ancient imperialism, it was not a question of opening new roads for its products and its capital, its objective was exclusively the despoiling of conquered countries. The backward state of production in antiquity could sustain the possessing classes of the conquering countries in luxury only by means of the more or less rapid ruination of the conquered peoples. Exhaustion of the conquered countries, growing difficulties in making new conquests, the gradual softening of the conquerors, all these sooner or later brought about the decline of ancient imperialisms. Rome provides the classic example of ancient imperialism. There have been great exaggerations concerning the commercial and industrial development of Rome. Its trade always showed a deficit. Rome drew exports from the provinces without giving anything back in return. The Roman ruling classes heartily despised every kind of trade. The Claudian law forbade senators, their sons, and the entire aristocracy of Rome to own ships drawing more than 300 amphoras, which corresponds to less than 225 bushels of grain or vegetables. This was equivalent to forbidding them to engage in trade. Caesar renewed this ban. Roman policy was never determined by its so-called commercial interests. The best proof of this is that Rome, after the defeat of Hannibal, still allowed the Carthaginians to bar entry into their sea. In general, it must be said that the Roman economic problems were unusually simple. The gradual conquest of Italy and the provinces more than occupied the surplusage of capital and population so that there was no crying need for industry and commerce, states Tenny Frank. The traders at Rome were as a rule foreigners, and it is that moreover which explains the continuous growth in the Jewish colony at Rome from Caesar's epoch on. Roman businessmen were not traders but usurers who looted the provinces. The development of trade in the Roman Empire must above all be ascribed to the growing luxury requirements of the ruling classes of Rome. Strabo explains the development of the great market of Delos in this fashion, hence arose a proverbial saying, "Merchant, come into port, discharge your freight, everything is sold." The Romans, having acquired wealth after the destruction of Carthage and Corinth, employed great numbers of domestic slaves. The same was true of industry. Roman industry depended primarily on the luxury requirements of the aristocracy. Tenny Frank, after observing that no appreciable progress was made in the domain of industry in the 4th century BC, adds, "In the 2 succeeding centuries we do not find evidence of any marked change in the nature of production at Rome. Doubtless the amount of ordinary ware produced at home increased with the growth of the city, but of goods worthy of export we do not hear. The only difference now is that work previously performed by free labor began in the 2nd century to fall into the hands of slaves." Even those authors who consider that Italy had been a producer country in the Republican epoch admit that it ceased to be one in the imperial period. Italy becomes less and less a producer country. Several industries which were prosperous at the end of the Republican period are now in decline. Thus trade between Italy and the Orient now takes place only in one direction, and it also becomes lodged more and more in the hands of Asiatics, of Alexandrians and Syrians. Thus Italy now lived only on the exploitation of the provinces. Small property, the foundation of Roman strength, was progressively supplanted by vast domains serving the luxury needs of the Roman aristocrats and on which slave labor predominated. Pliny's conclusion is known to all: lat fundia prodidere Italiam. The slave became more and more an item of luxury rather than a factor in production. Horace, in one of his satires, states that a minimum of 10 slaves was the indispensable prerequisite of a gentleman. Thousands of slaves did in fact work in the vast latifundia. In the domains of Tusculum and Tiber, on the shores of Terracina and Baiae, where the old Latin and Italian farmers had sown and reaped, there now rose in barren splendor the villas of the Roman nobles, some of which covered the space of a moderate-sized town with their appurtenances of garden grounds and aqueducts, fresh and salt water ponds for the preservation and breeding of river and marine fishes, nurseries of snails and slugs, game preserves for keeping hares, rabbits, stags, roes and wild boars, and aviaries in which even cranes and peacocks were kept. At the same time that free labor was being eliminated by slave labor, Italy became an immense center of squandering the wealth drained from the entire empire. Crushing taxes ruined the provinces, the frequent and costly naval armaments and coast defenses in order to check piracy, the task of supplying works of art, wild beasts, or other demands of the insane Roman luxury in circus, theater and the chase, were just as frequent as they were oppressive and incalculable. A single instance may show how far things were carried. During the 3 years' administration of Sicily by Gaius Verres, the number of farmers in Leontini fell from 84 to 32, in Motia from 187 to 86, in Herbita from 252 to 120, in Agirium from 250 to 80, so that in 4 of the most fertile districts of Sicily, 59% of the landholders preferred to let their fields lie fallow rather than to cultivate them under this regime. In the client states the forms of taxation were somewhat different, but the burdens themselves were if possible still worse, since in addition to the exactions of the Romans there came those of the native courts. Roman capitalism, to the extent that the term capitalism is applicable here, was essentially speculative and bore no relationship whatever to the development of the productive forces. Roman trade and banking resembled organized brigandage. But still worse if possible and still less subject to any control, was the havoc committed by the Italian men of business among the unhappy provincials. The most lucrative portions of the landed property and the whole commercial and monetary business in the provinces were concentrated in their hands. Usury flourished as it had never flourished before. All the communities, it is said in a treatise published in 684-70, are ruined. The same truth is specially attested as regards Spain and Narbonese Gaul, the very provinces which, comparatively speaking, were still in the most tolerable economic position. In Asia Minor, even towns like Samos and Halicarnassus stood almost empty. Legal slavery seemed here a haven of rest compared with the torments to which the free provincials succumbed, and even the patient Asiatic had become, according to the descriptions of Roman statesmen themselves, weary of life. Even the statesmen of Rome herself publicly and frankly conceded that the Roman name was unutterably odious through all Greece and Asia. Clearly this system of parasitism and brigandage could not last indefinitely. The source of wealth from which Rome drew dried up. Long before the fall of Rome we witness a steady slowing up of trade. The arena for pillage contracted in the measure that Rome emptied the conquered countries of their substance. The fact that the production of grain, especially wheat, diminished, while the vine and olive tree conquered vast domains in the east and west, constituted an ominous token of the state of things. Luxury products displaced products which are indispensable for production and for reproduction of the labor force. The spread of the culture of vines and olive trees not only meant economic ruin for Italy but might also result in a corn famine throughout the empire. Trajan vainly tried to ward off this danger by compelling senators to buy land in Italy. His successors achieved as little. Luxury killed off production. Soon superb buildings will leave no more land for the plough at the toiler, Horace cried out. By the 3rd century, the decline in trade was complete. Relations with distant countries were cut off. Practically no Roman coins of the 3rd century have been found in India, which proves a breakdown of exchange between Rome and India. The decline of Egyptian agriculture became so pronounced in the 3rd century that it was necessary to forego a part of the deliveries of grain from this formerly wealthy province. These Egyptian deliveries had to be replaced by grain supplies from the province of Africa, the Algeria and Tunisia of today. Commodius found it necessary to establish a flotilla for transporting the grain grown in the province of Africa. We have seen that trade in the Roman Empire was primarily based on supplying the wealthy classes of Rome. Is there any wonder then that exhaustion of the provinces was followed by a decline in trade? More and more, Roman emperors were compelled to resort to requisitions in kind, which only resulted, however, in aggravating the lot of the suffering provinces. The system of requisitions was rampant. Corn, hides, wood for spears, and draft animals had to be delivered, and payment for them was irregular and indeed problematic. A purely natural economy, producing exclusively use values, slowly displaced the exchange of products. Whereas the Roman peace had formerly brought about a regular exchange of goods and the equalizing of living conditions between the different regions of the empire, in the anarchy of the 3rd century each country was often condemned to live upon itself, painfully and poorly. An attempt has been made to explain the gradual displacement of slavery by the colony system either as a result of the lack of energy on the part of landed proprietors or by a shortage of slaves caused by the termination of foreign wars. The gradual ruin of the colonies, the halt in the flow of their products, was probably the main reason. The great proprietors, more and more reduced to living on the products of their own lands, were interested in replacing slave labor, relatively low in productivity, by the colony system, which resembles the system of serfdom that flourished in the Middle Ages. The colonist owes his master everything that the serf will have to give his lord. The power of the landed proprietors, who often possess enormous areas of land, kept growing continuously. In Egypt, in the 5th century the peasants will be completely subject to them. State administration passed entirely into their hands. It is therefore quite inaccurate to view the natural economy which flourished in the Carolingian epoch as an outgrowth of the fall of the Roman Empire and the destruction of Mediterranean economic unity. Undoubtedly the barbarian invasions played a very important role in the decline of ancient trade and in the rise of feudal economy. But the economic decline of the Roman Empire began long before the fall of Rome and several centuries before the Muslim invasion. Another very important indication of the evolution toward a natural economy was the monetary change which had already begun under the reign of Nero. Copper increasingly replaced gold and silver. In the 2nd century, there was an almost complete dearth of gold. The development of a natural economy, of an economy primarily producing use values, was consequently far from being an abnormal phenomenon as Perrin claims. The Roman Empire was ruined economically before it was ruined politically. The political blow to the Roman Empire was rendered possible only by its economic decline. The political anarchy of the 3rd century, like the barbarian invasion, can be explained accurately and exclusively by the economic decline of the Roman Empire. To the extent that the provinces were ruined, an intensive exchange of goods ceased, and a return took place to a natural economy. To that same extent the very existence of the empire became a matter of indifference to the possessing classes. Each country, each province withdrew into its shell. The empire, with its immense administrative apparatus and its extremely costly army, became a cancer, a parasitic organism whose unbearable weight pressed down on all classes. Taxes devoured the substance of the peoples. Under Marcus Aurelius, when the soldiers after their great victories against the Marcomanni, demanded an increase in pay, the emperor made the significant reply, "Everything you would receive above your usual pay would first have to be drained from the blood of your relations." The treasury was exhausted. In order to maintain the administrative apparatus and the army, it was necessary to confiscate individual fortunes. While the lower classes were in ceaseless revolt, the possessing classes were turning away from the empire, which was ruining them. After the economic ruin of the empire by the aristocracy was in its turn mined by the empire. Daily people could be seen who only yesterday were still among the wealthiest and today have to take up the beggar's staff, said Herodian. The soldiers grew more and more bestial. It was not greed alone which forced them to despoil the inhabitants, impoverishment of the provinces and the wretched state of transportation, which created difficulties in provisioning the armies, forced the soldiers to use violence in order to find their means of subsistence. Caracalla, in granting Roman citizenship to all Roman inhabitants, sought only to increase the taxable population. Irony of history, the whole world became Roman when Rome was no longer anything. The exactions of the Roman administration and the excesses of the soldiery incited all the inhabitants of the empire to hope for its destruction. The quartering of soldiers was a real disaster. The population of Syria regarded an occupation by the Parthians as a relief in comparison with a prolonged stay of Roman troops. The Roman government appeared every day, more odious and oppressive to its subjects. The severe Inquisition, which confiscated their goods and tortured their persons, compelled the subjects of Valentinian to prefer the more simple tyranny of the barbarians. They abjured and abhorred the name of Roman citizen, which had formerly excited the ambitions of mankind. The Christian writer Salvian stated in De Gubernatione Dei, Hence all the Romans in that region, Gaul and Spain, had but one desire, that they may never have to return to the Roman jurisdiction. Yet we are surprised that the Goths are not conquered by our resistance, when the Romans would rather live among them than at home. I could find occasion to wonder why all the poor and needy taxpayers do not follow their example, except for one factor that hinders them, namely, that they cannot transfer their poor possessions and homes in their households. Far from being an abnormal phenomenon, the barbarian invasion was the normal consequence of the economic and political decline of the empire. Even without the invasions, the empire would probably have been dismembered. In Asia Minor, as well as in Syria, one of the leading features of life was the gradual reversion to the feudal system. The so-called revolt of the Isaurians in Asia Minor is another symptom of the same tendency towards the formation of almost independent states within the empire. Similarly, the attempt to create an independent Gallo-Roman empire, the attempts at secession, prove how weak had become the bond of empire. The barbarians only gave the coup de grace to the shaking edifice of the Roman state. The fundamental cause for the decline of the Roman Empire must be sought in the contradiction between the growing luxuriousness of the possessing classes, between the incessant growth of surplus value, and the static character of the mode of production. During the entire Roman epoch, very little progress was registered in the sphere of production. The tools of the cultivator retained their primitive form. Plow, spade, hoe, mattock, pick, fork, scythe, sickle and pruning knife, were, as the surviving specimens show, just as they had been handed down from generation to generation. The growing luxury of the Roman aristocracy and the expenses of imperial administration were covered by a furious exploitation of the provinces, which had as its consequence economic ruin, depopulation, exhaustion of the soil. Unlike the capitalist world, which must perish from the relative superabundance of means of production, the Roman world perished from their scarcity. The reforms of Diocletian and of Constantine constituted an attempt to set the Roman Empire on the foundations of a natural economy. The state had now to be based on the country and the peasants. The peasant was now chained to his bit of land. Each landed proprietor became responsible for his domain and for the number of coloni who were established on it. The new tax was assessed on this basis. The reform of taxation by Diocletian and the edicts of later emperors made the colonus a serf, bound to his domicile and to his master. The same was true of the other layers of the population. Small proprietors, artisans, merchants, all were chained to their living place and to their profession. The epoch of Constantine is the epoch of the unlimited rule of the great landed proprietors, undisputed masters of vast princely domains. The aristocracy more and more abandons the cities which fall into decay and flees to sumptuous country villas where it lives surrounded by its clients and its serfs. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine constituted attempts to adapt the empire to a natural economy. But we have seen that the empire had, on this basis, no reason for existence. Its various parts could be held together longer only by tyranny. Thus, if from the economic and social point of view, Constantine ushers in a new historical era, symbolized by the adoption of Christianity, from the political point of view, he opens the last act in the history of the Roman Empire. See Judaism and Christianity. The situation which the Jews had acquired for themselves in the Hellenistic epoch appears to have undergone no fundamental transformation after the Roman conquest. The privileges conferred upon the Jews by Hellenistic laws were confirmed by the Roman emperors. The Jews enjoyed a privileged position in the Roman Empire. The fact that nearly 1 million Jews lived in Alexandria alone is sufficient evidence of their primarily commercial role in the dispersion, which embraced 3.5 million Jews several centuries before the seizure of Jerusalem, whereas hardly 1 million continued to live in Palestine. Alexandria in Egypt, under the Roman emperors, was what Tyre had been in the epoch of Phoenician commercial glory. Under the reign of the Ptolemies, a direct trade between Egypt and India had been established. From Thebes, caravans went to Meroe in Upper Nubia, whose markets were also frequented by caravans from the interior of Africa. A Roman fleet went to the mouth of the Nile to receive the precious objects and distribute them in the empire. 2 out of the 5 sections of Alexandria were inhabited by Jews. The role of the Jews at Alexandria was so important that a Jew, Tiberius Julius Alexander, was appointed Roman governor of this city. From the cultural standpoint, these Alexandrian Jews were completely assimilated and no longer spoke anything but Greek. It was on their account that the Hebrew religious books had to be translated into that language. Communities similar to that of Alexandria were located in all the commercial centers of the empire. The Jews spread over Italy, Gaul, and Spain. Jerusalem continued to be the religious center of diaspora Judaism. The successors of David and Solomon were of hardly more significance for the Jews of that age than Jerusalem for those of the present day. The nation found doubtless for its religious and intellectual unity a visible rallying point in the petty kingdom of Jerusalem, but the nation itself consisted not merely of the subjects of the Hasmoneans, but of the innumerable bodies of Jews scattered through the whole Parthian and the whole Roman Empire. Within the cities of Alexandria especially and of Cyrene, the Jews formed special communities administratively and even locally distinct, not unlike the Jews' quarters of our towns, but with a freer position and superintended by a master of the people as superior judge and administrator. Even at this time the predominant business of the Jews was trade. In the Sibylline books of the Maccabean period, it is stated that all the seas are overflowing with Jews. According to Strabo, it was not easy to discover a place in the entire world where Jews were not to be found and which was not ruled, financially, by them. Students of national economy have no doubt that the majority of these Jews in antiquity depended on commerce and industry for their livelihood. Jerusalem was a great and wealthy city of 200,000 inhabitants. Its importance lay above all in the Temple of Jerusalem. The inhabitants of the city and of its suburbs lived primarily from the mass of pilgrims who flocked to the holy city. The Jews of Palestine regarded their God as the means by which they lived. It was not alone the priests who lived from the service of Jehovah but also innumerable grocers, money changers, and artisans. Even the laborers and fishermen of Galilee certainly found markets for their products in Jerusalem. It would be erroneous to think of Palestine as entirely inhabited by Jews. In the north, there were several Greek cities, almost all the rest was inhabited generally, as each place in particular, by mixed tribes of Egyptians, Arabians, and Phoenicians, Strabo tells us. Jewish proselytism took on increasingly imposing proportions toward the beginning of the Christian era. To be members of so widely ramified and prosperous a commercial organization was a prospect that must have been enticing to not a few. As early as 139 BC, the Jews were banished from Rome for recruiting proselytes. At Antioch, the larger part of the Jewish community consisted of converts. It was solely the economic and social position of the Jews in the diaspora which, even before the fall of Jerusalem, made possible their religious and national cohesion. But while it is obvious that the majority of Jews played a commercial role in the Roman Empire, we must not think that all the Jews were rich traders or entrepreneurs. On the contrary, the majority was certainly made up of small people, some of them making their living directly or indirectly from trade, peddlers, stevedores, petty artisans, etc. It is this mass of small people which was first hit by the decline of the Roman Empire and suffered most from Roman extortion. Concentrated in great masses in the cities, they were capable of greater resistance than peasant peoples dispersed in the country. They were also more conscious of their interests. Consequently, the Jewish mass in the great cities will prove to be a continuous hotbed of unrest and uprisings, directed simultaneously against Rome and against the rich. It has become traditional to portray the Jewish insurrection in 70 as a great national uprising. However, while this insurrection was directed against the unbearable exactions of the Roman procurators, it was just as resolutely hostile to the native wealthy classes. All the aristocrats took a stand against the revolt. King Agrippa and other members of the wealthy classes strove mightily to put it down. The zealots first had to massacre the men of property before they could get at the Romans. King Agrippa and Berenice, after the failure of their efforts at conciliation, were to be found not alongside the insurgents but side by side with the Romans. The members of the ruling classes who, like Flavius Josephus, had assumed the guise of wishing to aid the revolutionists, rushed to betray them shamefully. On the other hand, the revolt in Judea was not the only one of its kind. Several revolts broke out in the Greek cities during the reign of Vespasian. An intense social agitation was conducted by the Cynic philosophers whom Vespasian had to drive out of the cities. The Alexandrines also showed their hostile feelings to Vespasian. The example of Bithynia and the disturbances in Alexandria under Trajan show that the social antagonism of which we have spoken never subsided in Asia Minor or in Egypt. But social unrest was not confined to the urban masses, even though they were the most affected by the growing decay in economic life. The peasant masses also began to move. The condition of the peasants was already very bad in the 1st and 2nd centuries. The situation of the latter grew steadily worse. The conditions under which the masses of the Egyptian population lived were far from normal. Taxation was oppressive, the mode of collection was brutal and unfair. Under Marcus Aurelius, the discontent spread to all the provinces. Spain refused to supply soldiers, Gaul was full of deserters. The revolts spread in Spain, in Gaul, in Africa. In a petition to Emperor Commodius, the small African farmers declared, "We shall fly to a place where we will be able to live like free men." During the reign of Septimus Severus, banditry took on unheard of proportions. Bands of homeless ravaged various parts of the empire. In a petition, a copy of which has been found recently, the small farmers of Lydia in Asia Minor addressed Septimus Severus in these terms: "When the tax collectors of the emperor appear in the villages, they bring nothing good. They torment the inhabitants with unbearable levies and with fines." Other petitions speak of the brutality and arbitrariness of these same tax officials. The poverty of the urban and rural masses offered a fertile soil for the propagation of Christianity. Rostovtsev correctly sees a link between the Jewish revolts and the popular revolts in Egypt and in Cyrenaica under the reigns of Trajan and of Hadrian. It was among the poor layers of the great cities of the diaspora that Christianity spread. The first communistic congregation of the Messiah was formed in Jerusalem, but congregations soon arose in other cities having a Jewish proletariat. The oldest, stations of Phoenician land and sea commerce, were also the most ancient seats of Christianity. Just as the Jewish insurrections were followed by insurrections of the non-Jewish popular masses, so did the Jewish communist religion rapidly find its extension among these pagan masses. The primitive Christian community was not born on the terrain of Orthodox Judaism, it was tightly bound up with heretical sects. It was under the influence of the Essenes, a Jewish communist sect which, according to Philo, possessed neither property, houses, slaves, lands, nor flocks. They tilled the soil and were forbidden to engage in trade. Christianity, in its beginnings, must be considered as a reaction of the laboring masses of the Jewish people against the domination of the wealthy commercial classes. Jesus, driving the merchants out of the temple, expresses the hatred of the Jewish popular masses against their oppressors, their hostility to the leading role of the wealthy business people. At the start, the Christians formed only small communities of no great importance. But in the 2nd century, an era of great poverty in the Roman Empire, they succeeded in becoming an extremely powerful party. In the 3rd century, the Christian Church acquired enormous strength. In the 3rd century, evidence of Christianity greatly increased in Alexandria. The popular, anti-plutocratic character of primitive Christianity is incontestable. "Blessed are ye poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are ye that hunger now, for ye shall be filled. But woe unto you that are rich, woe unto you, ye that are full now. For ye shall hunger," states the Gospel according to Luke 6:20, 6:21, 6:24, 6:25. The Epistle of James is equally positive: "Come now, ye rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver are rusted, and their rust shall be for a testimony against you, and shall eat your flesh as fire. Behold, the hire of the laborers who mowed your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth out, and the cries of them that reaped have entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth." James 5:1, 5, 4. But with the rapid development of Christianity, its leaders labored to blunt its trenchant anti-plutocratic spirit. The Gospel according to Matthew shows the change which has taken place. There it is stated, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." Matthew 5:3, 5, 6. The poor have become the poor in spirit. The kingdom of God is now only the kingdom of heaven. The famished now only hunger for righteousness. The revolutionary religion of the popular masses is changed into a religion of consolation for these same masses. Kautsky compares this phenomenon to social democratic revisionism. It would be more accurate to compare this evolution to the fascist phenomenon which we are experiencing at the present time. Fascism also attempts to make use of socialism in order to strengthen the rule of finance capital. It unhesitatingly uses the most brazen falsehoods to deceive the masses, to represent the rule of the tycoons of heavy industry as the rule of labor. Nevertheless, the fascist revolution also has a certain economic and social content. It definitely closes the liberal epoch and inaugurates the epoch of the complete domination of monopoly capitalism, the antithesis of free competitive capitalism. Similarly, it is inadequate merely to say that Christianity became an instrument for deceiving the poor classes. It also became the ideology of the class of landed proprietors who seized absolute power under Constantine. Its triumph coincided with the complete triumph of a natural economy. Simultaneously with Christianity, feudal economies spread all over Europe. It is certainly false to hold Christianity responsible for the fall of the empire. But it furnished the ideological armament for the classes which arose on its ruins. The most simple interest was condemned by the clergy of the East and West. It thus took in hand the interests of the new possessing class whose entire wealth came solely from the land. The primary reason for the failure of proletarian Christianity and the triumph of fascist Christianity must be sought in the backward state of the mode of production of this epoch. Economic conditions were not as yet ripe for the triumph of communism. The class struggles of the 2nd and 3rd century resulted in no gain whatever for the popular masses. This does not mean that the poor classes accepted the triumph of Catholicism without resistance. The lush growth of heresies furnishes the best proof that the contrary was true. If the official church persecuted these heresies with such great fury, it was because they represented, at least in part, the interests of the poor classes. An author of the 4th century writes of Constantinople, "This city," he says, "is full of slaves and craftsmen who are all of them profound theologians and preach in the shops and in the streets. Ask a man to change a piece of money for you and he will tell you wherein the Son is different from the Father. Ask another the price of a loaf of bread, he will reply that the Son is lower than the Father. Should you inquire if your bath is ready, you will be told that the Son was created out of nothing." As we have seen, Christianity was originally the ideology of the poor Jewish masses. The first churches were formed around the synagogues. The Judo-Christians had their own gospel, which was called the Gospel according to the Hebrews. But probably the Judo-Christians disappeared quite rapidly in the great Christian community. They were assimilated into the great mass of converts. After the 3rd century, epoch of the great expansion of Christianity, we hear no more of the Jewish community of Alexandria. It is probable that the majority of Alexandrian Jews entered the bosom of the Church. The Alexandrian Church for a certain time acquired hegemony within the new religion. At the Nicene Council, it played a leading role relative to the other Christian communities. But while the poor layers of Judaism ardently embraced the teachings of Jesus, the same was not true of the ruling and commercial classes. On the contrary, they vigorously persecuted the primitive communist religion. Later, when Christianity became the religion of the great proprietors, when its initial anti-plutocratic tendencies were limited to trade and usury, obviously even an opposition to it by the well-to-do Jewish classes could have lost none of its sharpness. On the contrary, Judaism became more and more conscious of its own role. Despite the decline of the empire, the role of trade was far from ended. The ruling classes still needed luxury products from the East. If the Jews played an important role in trade in preceding epochs, they now became practically the sole intermediaries between the East and the West. Jew became more and more the synonym for merchant. The triumph of a natural economy and of Christianity thus allowed the completion of the selective process which transformed the Jews into a commercial class. Toward the end of the Roman Empire, there certainly still existed groups of Jews whose primary occupation was agriculture or cattle raising, in Arabia, Babylonia, North Africa. The Jews had certainly not disappeared in Palestine, far from it. Contrary to the opinion of idealist historians and ideologists, the Palestinian Jews were not dispersed to the four corners of the earth by the Romans. We have seen that the diaspora had other roots. In 484, the emperors had a great deal of difficulty in suppressing a violent revolt of Samaritan peasants. At the beginning of the 7th century, the Jews attacked Tyre, devastating its environs. In 614, the Jewish battalions of Tiberiad, Nazareth, and Galilee assisted the Persian king in conquering Jerusalem, where a host of the inhabitants were slaughtered. Even in the time of the Mohammedan invasion, the Jews, according to Caro, constituted the bulk of the Palestinian population. The Mohammedan conquest produced the same effects there that it did in all conquered countries. The subjugated population was progressively assimilated by the conquerors. Just as Egypt completely lost its own character under Mohammedan rule, so Palestine was definitively despoiled of its Jewish character. Even today, certain rites of Arab peasants in Palestine recall their Jewish origin. In other countries as well, the Jewish agricultural or pastoral groups were subjected to strong assimilationist pressure and succumbed sooner or later, and that is the essential phenomenon more and more discernible through historical evolution. Only the Jewish communities with a clearly defined commercial character, numerous in Italy, in Gaul, in Germany, etc., proved capable of resisting all attempts at assimilation. What remains of the pastoral Jewish tribes of Arabia or the Jewish farmers of North Africa? Nothing but legends. As against this, the Jewish commercial colonies of Gaul, Spain, and Germany developed and flourished. One can only say, therefore, that if the Jews have been preserved, it was not despite their dispersion but because of it. If there had been no diaspora prior to the fall of Jerusalem, if the Jews had remained in Palestine, There is no reason to believe that their fate would have been different from that of all the other nations of antiquity. The Jews, like the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, would have been mixed up with the conquering nations, would have adopted their religion and their customs. Even if the present inhabitants of Palestine would have continued to bear the name of Jews, they would have had as little in common with the ancient Hebrews as the inhabitants of Egypt, Syria, and Greece had with their ancestors of antiquity. All the peoples of the Roman Empire were carried away in its fall. Only the Jews have been preserved because they brought into the barbarian world, which followed upon the Roman, vestiges of the commercial development which had characterized the ancient world. After the Mediterranean world was dismembered, they continued, among themselves, to link its scattered parts together. D. The Jews after the fall of the Roman Empire. It is consequently the transformation of the Jewish nation into a class which is at the bottom of the preservation of Judaism. In the epoch of the ruin of the Roman Empire, their commercial role continued to gain in importance. While the Jews had already participated in world commerce prior to the fall of the Roman Empire, they attained even greater prosperity after its end. It is probable that the Syrian merchants referred to in the same period were also Jews. Such a confusion was common in antiquity. Ovid, for example, speaks of the day unsuited to business, on which every week falls the festival celebrated by the Syrians of Palestine. In the 4th century, the Jews belonged to the well-to-do and wealthy layers of the population. Chrysostom states that the Jews possessed large sums of money and that their patriarchs assembled immense treasures. He speaks of the wealth of the Jews as if it were a fact well known to his contemporaries. For many centuries, the Jews continued to be the sole commercial intermediaries between the East and the West. Spain and France progressively became the centers of Jewish life. The Arab postmaster in Spain, Ibn Khordadbeh, in the Book of Routes, 857-874, mentions the Radhamite Jews who speak Persian, Roman, Arab, and the Frankish, Spanish and Slav languages. They voyaged from the Occident to the Orient, and from the Orient to the Occident, now by land and now by sea. They bring from the Occident eunuchs, women slaves, boys, silk, furs and swords. They embark in the land of the Franks, on the Western Sea and sail to Farama, Palustum. They proceed to Zint, India, and China. On returning they are laden with musk, aloes, camphor, cinnamon and other products of eastern lands. Some set sail for Constantinople in order to sell their merchandise there, others repair to the country of the Frank. Theodulf's verses relating to the wealth of the Orient doubtless referred to the goods imported by the Jews. Spain is further mentioned in the text of a formula of Louis the Pious, with reference to the Jew Abraham of Saragossa. The Jews therefore, were the purveyors of spices and costly fabrics. But we see from Agabar's texts that they also dealt in wine. And on the banks of the Danube they traded in salt. In the 10th century, the Jews possessed salt mines near Nuremberg. They also traded in arms, and exploited the treasuries of the churches. But their great specialty was their trade in slaves. Some of these slaves were sold in the country, but the majority were exported to Spain. Jew and merchant become synonymous terms. Thus it is stated in an edict of King Louis, merchants, that is to say Jews and other merchants, from wherever they come, from this country or other countries, must pay a just tax both for slaves and for other merchandise, just as has been the custom under other kings. According to Brutskas, the name Radhamites, which a section of the Jewish merchants had, comes from the river Rhone, from which their ships sailed. In various chronicles the designation of naughty Rhodanisi is also to be found. There can be no doubt that in the Carolingian period, the Jews were the principal intermediaries between the East and the West. Their already dominant position in trade in the epoch of the decline of the Roman Empire was excellent preparation for this role. Then they were treated as equals of the Roman citizens. The poet Rutilius complained that the vanquished nation was oppressing the conquerors. In the middle of the 4th century Jewish traders had located themselves at Tungra and Tournai. The bishops had the best relations with them and strongly encouraged their trade. In 470 Apollinaris Sidonius requested the bishop of Tournai to receive a certain Jew favorably, in view of the fact that these people generally did a very fine business. In the 6th century, Gregory of Tours speaks of colonies of Jews at Clermont-Ferrand and at Orleans. Lyons similarly had a large population of Jewish traders at this time. The Archbishop of Lyons, Agabar, complains in De Insolentia Judaeorum that the Jews were selling Christian slaves in Spain. A monk of St. Gallen in the 8th century mentions a Jew living in the country of the Franks who brought precious things from Palestine. It is consequently obvious that in the first centuries of the Middle Ages the Jews in France were primarily traders. In Flanders, where the Jews lived from the Norman invasions up to the First Crusade, trade was lodged in their hands. Towards the end of the 9th century, there was a large Jewish community at Huy. The Jews occupied an important position there and had a flourishing trade. In 1040, at Liège, trade was in their hands. In Spain, all foreign trade was exploited by them. This trade extended over all the country's provisions, wine, oil, minerals, cloth and spices reached them from the Levant. The same was true in Gaul. The Jews of Poland and Little Russia also came to Western Europe in order to sell slaves, furs, and salt there, and to buy all kinds of cloth. We read in a Hebraic source of the 12th century that the Jews purchased large quantities of Flemish cloth on the Rhenish markets in order to trade them in Russia for furs. Jewish trade between Mainz and Kiev, according to Buren, the most important trade post of the southern plain, was very intensive. There was certainly an important trading colony of Jews at Kiev in this period, since we read in a chronicle of 1113 that in order to prevail upon Monmac, Constantine IX, Emperor of the Orient, to come to Kiev as soon as possible, the inhabitants of the city let him know that the population was prepared to pillage the boyars, feudal lords, and the Jews. The Arabian traveler Ibrahim al-Tarwahi similarly attests to the scope of Jewish trade between Europe and the Orient. He writes, in 973, on visiting Mainz, "It is marvelous to find, at such a distant point in the west, spices originating in the most remote east." In accounts of the travels of the Spanish Jews Degorianides, Quaspini, and Abraham ibn Yaakov, of the 10th century, mention is made of the price of wheat at Krakow and Prague, also of salt mines belonging to Jews. According to Gunpowix, the Jews were the sole intermediaries between the shores of the Baltic and Asia. An old document thus characterizes the Khazars, a Mongol tribe of the Caspian Sea which became converted to Judaism. They have no slaves to the land because they buy everything by means of money. Idil, the capital of the Khazars, was a great commercial center, the starting point for the transport of goods eventually ending up at Mainz. The convert Hermann relates, in an autobiographical work, that while he was still a Jew, he traveled regularly when he was 20 years old, about 1127, between Cologne and Mainz in the pursuit of commercial matters, for all Jews are engaged in trade, siquidem omnes Judad negotiationi inservient. The words of our Eliza ben Naden are also characteristic of the period, trade, but that is our principal means of subsistence. The Jews constituted the only class to make its living by trading. At the same time, thanks to the contacts which they maintained among themselves, they constituted the only economic link which survived between East and West. The situation of the Jews in the first half of the Middle Ages was therefore extremely favorable. The Jews were considered as being a part of the upper classes in society and their juridical position was not perceptibly different from that of the nobility. Under Charles the Bald, the Pistensian Edict punished the sale of impure gold or silver by the whip when serfs or those liable to forced labor were involved and by a money fine when the culprits were Jews or freemen. The Jews of the earlier period filled a great need in the general economy which for a long time could not be filled by anybody else, namely, the need for carrying on a professional trade in goods. Bourgeois historians generally do not see any great difference between ancient or medieval trade and usury and the capitalism of our epoch. Nevertheless, there is at least as great a difference between capitalism and medieval business, and the usury to which the latter is linked, as there is between the great capitalist proprietor working for the market and the feudal lord, between the modern proletarian and the serf or slave. In the epoch of the commercial prosperity of the Jews, the prevailing mode of production was feudal. Essentially, it was use values that were produced and not exchange values. Each domain was self-sufficient. Only certain luxury products, spices, precious goods, etc., were objects of exchange. The lords yielded a portion of the gross products of their lands for the rare merchandise coming from the Orient. Feudal society based on the production of use values, and capitalism, in its commercial and usurious primitive form, do not exclude one another but complement each other. An independent and prevailing development of capital in the shape of merchants' capital signifies that production is not subject to capital. The independent development of merchants' capital stands therefore in an inverse ratio to the general economic development of society. So long as merchants' capital promotes the exchange of products between undeveloped societies, commercial profit does not only assume the shape of outbargaining and cheating, but also arises largely from these methods. leaving aside the fact that it exploits the difference in prices of production of the various countries, and in this respect it tends to level and fix the values of commodities. Those modes of production bring it about that merchant's capital appropriates to itself the overwhelming portion of the surplus product, either in its capacity as a mediator between societies, which are yet largely engaged in production of use values and for whose economic organization the sale of that portion of its product which is transferred to the circulation, or any sale of products at their value, is of minor importance, or, because under those former modes of production, the principal owners of the surplus product, with whom the merchant has to deal, are the slaveholder, the feudal landlord, the state, for instance, the Oriental despot, and they represent the wealth and luxury which the merchant tries to trap. Whereas modern commercial or bank capital is, from an economic standpoint, only an appendage to industrial capital and appropriates only a part of the surplus value created in the process of capitalist production, commercial and usury capital realizes its profits by exploiting differences in the costs of production of various countries and by taking for itself a portion of the surplus value extorted by the feudal lords from their serfs. It is always the same goods into which money is converted in the first phase and which, in the second phase, is converted into more money. The Jewish merchant did not invest money in production as the merchant of the great medieval cities does several centuries later. He does not purchase raw materials, nor finance the draper artisans. His merchant's capital is merely the intervening movement between extremes not controlled by it and between premises not created by it. Lending at interest, usury, is closely linked to commerce. If accumulated wealth in the hands of the feudal class implies luxury in the trade which serves to procure it, luxury, in its turn, becomes the distinctive hallmark of wealth. In the beginning, accumulated surplus product allows the lord to acquire spices, oriental cloths, silks. Later, all these products become the attributes of the ruling class. The cloth begins to make the monk. And when regular income does not allow the proprietor class to lead the kind of life which has become habitual, it must borrow. A second personage is added to the merchant, the usurer. Generally, in this period the second personage is identical with the first. Only the merchant has the necessary cash for the rich noble wastrel. But it is not alone the lord who has recourse to the usurer. When the king has to assemble an army immediately and the normal revenue from taxation is inadequate, he is compelled to go to the man with the cash. When the peasant, because of a bad harvest, an epidemic, or the overwhelming burden of taxes, forced contributions, and compulsory service, can no longer meet his obligations, when he has eaten up his seed, when he can no longer replace his worn-out tools, he must borrow his requirements from the usurer. The treasury of the usurer is therefore indispensable to a society based on a natural economy. It constitutes the reserve on which society draws when various accidental circumstances intervene. Interest-bearing capital, or usurer's capital, as we may call it in its ancient form, belongs like its twin brother, commercial capital, to the antediluvian forms of capital, which long precede the capitalist mode of production and are found in the most diverse economic formations of society. Often the kings and great lords pawned their tax revenues with the Jews. And it is in this way that we see Jews appearing in the role of tax farmers, tax collectors. The finance ministers of the kings of the early Middle Ages were often Jews. In Spain, up to the end of the 14th century the great Jewish bankers were also tax farmers. In Poland, the kings entrusted to the Jews the important functions of the financial administration of their domains. Under Casimir the Great and Vladislav Jagiello, not only were the public taxes farmed out to the Jews, but also such important sources of revenue as the royal mint and salt mines. Thus, for example, we know that in the second half of the 14th century the Rothschild of Krakow, Lewko, the banker to 3 Polish kings, leased the famous salt mines of the Wieliczka and Bochnia, and that he was also administrator of the mint at Krakow. So long as a natural economy reigned, the Jews were indispensable to it. It is its decline which gives the signal for persecutions against the Jews and will for a long time exert an adverse influence on their situation. 3. The period of the Jewish usurer. Up to the 11th century, the economic regime reigning in Western Europe is characterized by the absence of commodity production. The few cities which survived from the Roman era primarily fulfill administrative and military functions. All production is destined solely for local consumption, and the seigneurial domains, being sufficient to themselves, enter into contact with the wide world solely through Jewish merchants who brave its strange places. The commercial role played by Europeans could only be passive in character. But with time and with the continuous growth in the importation of Oriental goods, there is an incentive to produce directly for exchange. The development of trade thus stimulates native production. The production of use values progressively gives way to the production of exchange values. Not all native products are desired by the Orient. The production of exchange values first develops in those places where a set of conditions exists for the manufacture or extraction of certain goods especially prized abroad, monopoly products. Such were the woolens of England, the cloths of Flanders, the salt of Venice, copper from Dinan, etc. In these favored places, rapidly developed those specialized industries, the products of which were at once beyond their place of origin. Trade advances from the passive to the active stage and Florentine fabrics leave to conquer the wide world. As they are much sought after, these products are at the same time the source of enormous profits. This rapid accumulation of wealth is the basis for an accelerated development of a native merchant class. Thus, salt became a potent weapon in the hands of the Venetians for attaining wealth and for holding peoples in subjection. From the very beginning, these islanders had made a salt in their lagoons which was much sought after by all the peoples situated on the Adriatic and which brought Venice trading privileges, concessions, and advantageous treaties. So long as Europe lived under a regime of natural economy, the initiative in commercial traffic belonged to merchants from the Orient, principally the Jews. Only some peddlers, some lowly suppliers to the chateau of the nobles and the clergy, succeed in freeing themselves from the humble mass of serfs bound to the soil. But the development of native production makes possible the rapid formation of a powerful class of native merchants. Emerging from the artisans, they gain control over them by taking over the distribution of raw materials. Contrary to trade as conducted by the Jews, which is clearly separate from production, native trade is essentially based on industry. Everywhere industrial development marches hand in hand with expansion of trade. Venice had the advantage of being simultaneously one of the greatest commercial cities of the world and one of the most industrial. Its fabrics were of immense service to its traders in their relations with the Orient. Venice and its neighboring cities were full of all kinds of fabrics. In Italy, as in Flanders, the maritime commerce, and the inland commerce which was its continuation, resulted in the activity of the seaports, Venice, Pisa, and Genoa in the south, Bruges in the north. Then, behind the seaports, the industrial cities developed, on the one hand, the Lombard communes and Florence, on the other, Ghent, Ypres, and Lille, Douai, and further inland, Valenciennes, and Brussels. The woolen industry became the basis of the greatness and prosperity of the medieval cities. Cloths and fabrics constituted the most important goods in the fairs of the Middle Ages. In that is to be seen the profound difference between medieval capitalism and modern capitalism. The latter is based on a tremendous revolution in the means of production, the former reposed solely on the development of the production of exchange values. The evolution in exchange of medieval economy proved fatal to the position of the Jews in trade. The Jewish merchant importing spices into Europe and exporting slaves is displaced by respectable Christian traders to whom urban industry supplies the principal products for their trading. This native commercial class collides violently with the Jews, occupants of an outmoded economic position, inherited from a previous period in historical evolution. The growing contradiction between Christian and Jewish trade therefore leads to the opposition of two regimes, that of exchange economy as against natural economy. It was consequently the economic development of the West which destroyed the commercial function of the Jews, based on a backward state of production. The commercial monopoly of the Jews declined in the degree that the peoples, whose exploitation had fed it, developed. For a number of centuries the Jews remained the commercial guardians of the young nations, to the advantage of the latter and not without open recognition of this advantage. But every tutelage becomes burdensome when it continues longer than the dependence of the ward. Entire nations emancipate themselves from the tutelage of other nations, even as individuals used to, only by means of struggle. With the development of exchange economy in Europe, the growth of cities and of corporative industry, the Jews are progressively eliminated from the economic positions which they had occupied. This eviction is accompanied by a ferocious struggle of the native commercial class against the Jews. The Crusades, which were also an expression of the will of the city merchants to carve the road to the Orient, furnished them with the occasion for violent persecutions and bloody massacres of the Jews. From this period on, the situation of the Jews in the cities of Western Europe is definitely compromised. In the beginning, the economic transformation reaches only certain important urban centers. The seigneurial domains are very little affected by this change and the feudal system continues to flourish there. Consequently, the career of Jewish wealth is still not ended. The seigneurial domains still offer an important field of action to the Jews. But now Jewish capital, primarily commercial in the preceding period, becomes almost exclusively usurious. It is no longer the Jew who supplies the Lord with Oriental goods, but for a certain time it is still he who lends him money for his expenses. If during the preceding period Jew was synonymous with merchant, it now begins increasingly to be identified with usurer. It is self-evident that to claim, as do most historians, that the Jews began to engage in lending only after their elimination from trade, is a vulgar error. Usurious capital is the brother of commercial capital. In the countries of Eastern Europe, where the Jews were not evicted from commerce, we encounter, as we shall see later, a considerable number of Jewish usurers. In reality, the eviction of the Jews from commerce had as a consequence their entrenchment in one of the professions which they had already practiced previously. The fact that Jews at different periods may have held landed property cannot serve as a serious argument in favor of the traditional thesis of Jewish historians. Far from constituting a proof of the multiplicity of the occupations of the Jews, Jewish property must be considered as the fruit of their usurious and commercial operations. In the business books of the French Jew Heliot of Franche-Comté, who lived at the beginning of the 14th century, we find vineyards mentioned among his properties. But what clearly emerges from these books is that these vineyards did not constitute the basis of an agricultural profession for Heliot but were the product of his mercantile operations. When in 1360, the King of France had again invited the Jews into his territory, the representative of the Jews, a certain Manus, raised the problem of royal protection for the vineyards and cattle which would pass into the hands of the Jews as unredeemed securities. In Spain, in the time of great theological disputes between Jews and Christians, the latter blamed the Jews for having become wealthy as a result of their usurious operations. They have taken possession of fields and of cattle, they own 3/4 of the fields and lands of Spain. The passage of property of the nobility into the hands of the Jews was a common phenomenon in this epoch. Such was the village of Stryzov, in Bohemia, which had belonged to 2 nobles and was assigned in payment of debts to the Jews Fodor and Merklin, 1382. The village Slamany Uyist, in Moravia, was allotted to the Jew Aleksandaratic. The village Nevravo, in Lithuania, was assigned to the Jew Levon Salamak, etc. So long as the landed property of the Jews constituted solely an object of speculation for them, it could only have an extremely precarious character because the feudal class very early succeeded in imposing a ban upon mortgaging real properties with the Jews. It was altogether different wherever a genuine economic and social mutation took place, in those places where the Jews abandoned business in order to become real landowners. Sooner or later, they necessarily also changed their religion. At the beginning of the 15th century, a Jew named Wilczko, having become the proprietor of several villages, the King of Poland exerted every effort to lead him to acknowledge his blindness and to enter the Holy Christian religion. This fact is significant, for the kings of Poland carefully protected the Jewish religion. They would never have thought of converting Jewish merchants or bankers to Christianity. But a Jewish landowner in the Middle Ages could only be an anomaly. This is equally true as regards the Christian usurer. This problem naturally has nothing in common with the banalities on racial peculiarities. Clearly it is foolish to claim, with Sombart, that usury constitutes a specific trait of the Jewish race. Usury, which as we have seen plays an important role in pre-capitalist societies, is almost as old as humanity and has been practiced by all races and nations. It is enough to recall the leading role played by usury in Greek and Roman societies. But to pose the question in this way means to invert the conditions of the problem. It is not by the innate capacities or the ideology of a social group that we must explain its economic position. On the contrary, it is its economic position which explains its capacities and its ideology. Medieval society is not divided into lords and serf because each of these groups originally possessed specific qualifications for the economic role which it was to play. The ideology and capacities of each class formed gradually as a function of its economic position. The same is true of the Jews. It is not their innate predisposition for commerce which explains their economic position, but it is their economic position which explains their predisposition to commerce. The Jews moreover constitute a very heterogeneous racial conglomeration. In the course of their history, they have absorbed a multitude of non-Semitic ethnic elements. In England, the monopoly of usury brought them such wealth that some Christians undoubtedly went over to Judaism in order to participate in the Jewish monopoly in lending. Judaism therefore consists rather of the result of a social selection and not of a race having innate predispositions for commerce. But the primacy of the economic and social factor does not exclude, far from it, the influence of the psychological factor. As it is infantile to see the economic position of Judaism as the result of the predispositions of the Jews, just so it is puerile to consider it as the fruit of persecutions and of legal bans against exercising other professions than commerce or usury. In numerous writings on the economic life of the Jews in the Middle Ages, it is stated that they were excluded, from the very beginning, from artisanry, from traffic in goods, and that they were prohibited from possessing land property. That is only a fable. In fact, in the 12th century and in the 13th century, living in practically all of the great cities of Western Germany, they dwelt among the Christians and enjoyed the same civil rights as the latter. At Cologne, during an entire period, the Jews even possessed the right to compel a Christian, who had a claim to make against a Jew, to appear before Jewish judges in order to have the matter adjudged according to Hebraic law. It is just as false to assert that the Jews could not be admitted into the artisan guilds. True, several guilds did not admit what were termed Jewish children as apprentices, but this was not the case for all the guilds. The existence of Jewish goldsmiths and silversmiths, even in the period when the guild rules become far more severe, is sufficient proof of this. There were certainly few Jewish blacksmiths, masons, and carpenters among the artisans of the Middle Ages, but Jewish parents who gave their children into apprenticeship in these trades were very rare. Even the guilds which excluded the Jews did not do so out of religious animosity or racial hatred, but because the trades of usury and peddling were reputedly dishonest. The guilds excluded the children of Jewish business people engaged in usury or peddling, in the same way that they did not accept the sons of simple laborers, carters and boatsmen, barbers, and weavers of linen into their ranks. Feudal society was essentially a caste society. It desired that everyone should remain in his place. It fought usury by Christians just as it made it impossible for the bourgeois to attain nobility, and just as it disdained the noble who lowered himself to the practice of a trade or to engaging in business. In 1462 the Dr. Hahn Winter was driven from the city of Nördlingen because he practiced usury through the intermediary of a Jew. 30 years later, in the same city, a bourgeois named Kinkel was placed in the pillory and driven from the city for having practiced the Jewish profession. The Synod of Bamberg, in 1491, threatened to drive every Christian practicing usury, either by himself or through the intermediary of Jews, out of the Christian community. In 1487, in Silesia, it was decreed that every Christian practicing usury would be placed in the hands of the royal tribunal and punished in exemplary fashion. So long as the feudal structure remains solid, the attitude of Christian society toward loans at interest does not change. But the deep-seated economic mutations which we have examined previously transform the conditions of the problem. Industrial and commercial development elevate banking to an indispensable role in economy. The banker advancing funds to the merchant or the artisan becomes an essential element in economic development. The treasury of the usurer, in the feudal era, fulfills the role of a necessary but absolutely unproductive reserve. The most characteristic forms, in which usurer's capital exists in time antedating capitalist production, are two. The same forms repeat themselves on the basis of capitalist production, but as mere subordinate forms. They are then no longer the forms which determine the character of interest-bearing capital. These two forms are, first, usury by lending money to extravagant persons of the higher classes, particularly to landowners; secondly, usury by lending money to the small producer who is in possession of his own means of employment, which includes the artisan, but more particularly the peasant, since under pre-capitalist conditions, so far as they permit of independent individual producers, the peasant class must form the overwhelming majority. The usurer makes loans to the feudal lords and to the kings for their luxuries and their war expenditures. He lends to the peasants and the artisans in order to allow them to pay their taxes, rents, etc. The money loaned by the usurer does not create surplus value, it merely allows him to take possession of a portion of the surplus product which already exists. The function of the banker is altogether different. He contributes directly to the production of surplus value. He is productive. The banker finances great commercial and industrial ventures. Whereas credit is essentially consumer credit in the feudal era, it becomes credit of production and of circulation in the era of commercial and industrial development. There is consequently a fundamental difference between the usurer and the banker. The first is the credit organ in the feudal era, whereas the second is the credit organ in the era of exchange economy. Ignoring this fundamental distinction leads almost all historians into error. They see no difference between the banker of antiquity, the Jewish banker of England of the 11th century, and Rothschild or even Fugger. Newman, says that the banker is respected while the usurer is hated and despised, because the banker lends to the rich, whereas the usurer lends to the poor. J. W. Newman, Lectures on Political Economy, London, 1851, p. 44. He overlooks the fact that the difference of two modes of production and the corresponding social orders intervenes here, and the latter is not exhausted by the distinction between rich and poor. Of course, this distinction becomes really obvious in the capitalist epoch properly so called. But the money-lender stands in the same relation to him, the merchant, in the former stages of society as he does the modern capitalist. This specific relation was felt also by the Catholic universities. The universities of Alcala, of Salamanca, of Ingolstadt, of Freiburg and the Breisgau, Mayence, Cologne, Treves one after another recognized the legality of interest on money for commercial loans. In the measure that economic development continues, the bank conquers ever more solid positions while the Jewish usurer increasingly loses ground. He is no longer to be found in the prosperous commercial cities of Flanders because the Jews, unlike the Lombards, only practiced placement at interest and did not play the role of intermediaries in commercial operations. After their elimination from commerce, a process which is accomplished in Western Europe in the 13th century, the Jews continued to develop the business of usury in regions not yet reached by exchange economy. In England, in the period of King Henry II, second half of the 12th century, they are already involved up to the hilt in usury. They are generally very rich and their clientele is composed of the great landed proprietors. The most famous of these Jewish bankers was a certain Aaron of Lincoln, very active at the end of the 12th century. King Henry II alone owed him £100,000, a sum equal to the annual budget of the Kingdom of England at this time. Thanks to the extremely high rate of interest, it fluctuated between 43 and 86%. A large number of estates of the nobility had passed into the hands of the Jewish usurers. But they had powerful associates and exacting ones. If the kings of England supported the business of the Jews, it was because it constituted a very important source of revenue for them. All loans made with the Jews were registered in the Scaccarium Judaeorum, exchequer of the Jews, and were assessed a tax of 10% in behalf of the royal treasury. But this legal contribution was far from sufficient for the kings. Any pretext was good enough for despoiling the Jews, and the income from their usury continually contributed to enlarging the royal treasury. It was particularly bad for the Jews to have the kings as important debtors. The rich banker Aaron of Lincoln found this out in 1187 when the King of England confiscated his property. The dispossessed nobility would avenge itself by organizing massacres of the Jews. In 1189, the Jews were massacred in London, Lincoln, and Stafford. A year later, the nobility, led by a certain Malabes, destroyed the Scaccarium Judaeorum of York. The notes were solemnly burned. The Jews, besieged in the chateau, committed suicide. But the king continued to protect the Jews even after their death. He demanded payment to himself of the sums to the Jews, by virtue of the fact that the Jews were the slaves of his treasury. Special employees were ordered by him to make an exact list of all the debts. At the beginning of the 13th century, the king granted a Magna Carta to the nobility which brought certain improvements in the sphere of loans. Nevertheless, in 1262 and in 1264, new disturbances broke out against the Jews. In 1290, the entire Jewish population of England, that is to say almost 3,000 people, was expelled and its property confiscated. The economic situation of the Jews of France, far more numerous than the English, 100,000, was not perceptibly different from that of the English Jews. With the accession of Philip Augustus, 1180, and in the first years of his reign, the Hebrews were rich and numerous in France. Learned rabbis had been attracted to the synagogue of Paris, which, on the solemn entry of Pope Innocent at St. Denis in 1135, had already figured among the corporations of the capital at the time of the passage of the pontiff. According to the historian Rigaud, they had acquired almost half of Paris. Their credits were spread throughout villages, cities, and suburbs, everywhere. A great number of Christians had even been expropriated by the Jews because of debts. It is mainly in northern France that the Jews were engaged in usury. In Provence during the 13th century, Jewish participation in trade was still very important. The Jews of Marseille were in regular business relations with Spain, North Africa, Sicily, and Palestine. They even owned ships, and like their ancestors of the Carolingian epoch, they imported spices, slaves, etc. But these are only vestiges from a previous period. Usury appears to constitute the principal economic function of the Jews of France in the 13th century. A notary was appointed in each city for dealings in loans. The interest rate rose to 43%. Up to the Statute of Milan, 1230, which prohibited the Jews from making loans on real property, the principal clients of the Jewish bankers were the princes and lords. At the beginning of the 12th century, the Jew Salomon of Dijon was the creditor of the greatest cloisters of France. The Count of Montpellier owed a Jew by the name of Bendet the sum of 50,000 sous. Pope Innocent III, in a letter to the King of France, expresses indignation at the fact that the Jews are taking possession of church property, that they are seizing lands, vineyards, etc. While the economic position of the Jews of France is similar to that of the English Jews, their political situation is different. Power, which was far more divided, placed them in the hands of a multitude of princes and lords. The Jews were subjected to a host of levies and taxes which enriched the powerful. Various means were utilized in order to extract the maximum of money from the Jews. Mass arrests, ritual trials, expulsions, all of these were used as pretexts for enormous financial extortions. The kings of France expelled and admitted the Jews a number of times in order to seize their property. The social and economic position of the Jews in Muslim Spain is not known with accuracy. There is, however, not the shadow of a doubt that they belong to the privileged classes of the population. Arriving in Granada, writes a certain Isaac de Alvira, I saw that the Jews here occupy leading positions. They have divided up the capital and the province. These accursed ones are everywhere at the head of the administration. They are engaged in the collection of taxes and live in luxury while you, Muslims, are clad in rags. In Christian Spain, in Castile, the Jews are bankers, tax farmers, quartermasters to the king. Royalty protects them as its economic and political supporters. The interest rate, lower than in other countries, is 33.3% at the beginning of the 12th century. In a great many cortes the nobility has struggled for a reduction in the rate of interest but has always met with the resistance of the kings. It was solely in the reign of Alphonse IX that the nobility achieved some concrete results in this sphere. A similar situation arose in Aragon. Jehuda de Cavaliera is a characteristic example of a great Jewish capitalist of the 13th century. He leased salt mines, coined money, supplied the army and possessed great estates and great herds of cattle. It was his fortune that made possible the construction of a battle fleet for the war against the Arabs. The economic backwardness of Spain made it possible for the Jews to preserve their commercial positions longer than in England or in France. Documents of the 12th century mention Jews of Barcelona who made voyages as far as the Bosphorus. In 1105, Count Bernard III granted a monopoly in the importation of Sicilian slaves to 3 Jews, merchants and proprietors of ships at Barcelona. We must await the 14th century, when Barcelona, according to Perrin, will be transformed into an enormous store and workshop, before the Jews are completely expelled from trade. Their situation then declined to such an extent that they were compelled to pay taxes in order to be able to pass through the city. The unfortunate Israelites, far from being merchants at Barcelona, entered it like merchandise. Jewish usury took on such dimensions in Aragon that serious movements against the Jews arose among the nobility and the bourgeoisie. In Germany, the primarily commercial period extends up to the middle of the 13th century. The Jews bring Germany into relations with Hungary, Italy, Greece, and Bulgaria. The slave trade flourishes up to the 12th century. Thus, we are reminded in the custom house tariffs of Wallenstadt and of Koblenz that Jewish slave merchants had to pay 4 dinars for each slave. A document of 1213 says of the Jews of Laubach that they were extraordinarily wealthy and that they conducted a great trade with the Venetians, the Hungarians, and the Croats. From the 13th century on, the importance of the German cities grows. As elsewhere, and for the same reasons, the Jews are eliminated from commerce and turn towards the banking business. The center of gravity of Jewish usury is concentrated in the nobility. The Acts of Nuremberg show the average debt contracted with the Jews rose to 282 gulden among the city people and 1,672 among the nobles. The same is true at the 87 notes of Ulm which belong to Jewish banking houses. Of the 17,302 gulden which they covered, 90% belonged to noble debtors. In 1344, the Jewish banker Feivelin loaned the Count of Zweibrücken £1,090. The same Feivelin, in collaboration with a certain Jacob Daniels, loaned 61,000 florins to the King of England, Edward III, in 1339. In 1451, Emperor Frederick III asked Pope Nicholas V for a privilege in behalf of the Jews, so that they could live in Austria and there make loans at interest to the great convenience of the nobility. In the 13th century, in Vienna, the Jews Lublin and Sklo are engaged in the important functions of finance administrators of the Austrian Duke, Kammerei Duces Austriae. But this state of affairs could not continue indefinitely. Usury slowly destroyed the feudal regime, ruined all classes of the population, without introducing a new economy in place of the old. In contrast to capital, usury is essentially conservative. Both usury and commerce exploit the various modes of production. They do not create it but attack it from the outside. Usury tries to maintain it directly in order to exploit it ever anew. Usury centralizes monetary wealth, where the means of production are disjointed. It does not alter the mode of production but attaches itself to it like a parasite and makes it miserable. It sucks its blood, kills its nerve and compels production to proceed under ever more disheartening conditions. Usurer's capital uses capital's method of exploitation without its mode of production. Despite this destructive effect, usury remains indispensable in backward economic systems. But there it becomes an important cause of economic stagnation, as can be seen in many Asiatic countries. If the burden of the usurer becomes more and more unbearable in Western Europe, it is because it is incompatible with the new economic forms. Exchange economy penetrates rural life. Industrial and commercial development of the cities deals a blow to the old feudal system in the country. A vast market opens up to agricultural products, which leads to a decided recession in the old forms of servitude, and of rents based on the natural economy. Hardly anywhere, save in regions which were difficult of access, or very remote from the great commercial movements, did serfdom retain its primitive form. Everywhere else, if it did not actually disappear, it was at least mitigated. One may say that from the beginning of the 13th century the rural population, in Western and Central Europe, had become or was in process of becoming a population of free peasants. Everywhere in Western Europe, and in part in Central Europe, the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries are the epoch of the development of Jewish usury. But economic evolution brings about its rapid decline. The definitive expulsion of the Jews took place at the end of the 13th century in England, at the end of the 14th century in France, at the end of the 15th century in Spain. These dates reflect the difference in the speed of economic development within these countries. The 13th century is an epoch of economic flowering in England. For Spain it is the 15th century which is the high point of the process wherein the Spanish kingdoms developed their commerce and added to their wealth. Sheep began to cover the countryside, and in the trade with the north of Europe Spanish began to compete with English wool. The exports of wool to the Low Countries were considerably increased, and sheep farming began to give Castile its characteristic aspect and to enrich the nobility. There was also an increasing trade with the north in iron from Bilbao, olive oil, oranges and pomegranates. Feudalism progressively gives way to a regime of exchange. As a consequence, the field of activity of Jewish usury is constantly contracting. It becomes more and more unbearable because it is less and less necessary. The more money becomes abundant as a result of the more intensive circulation of goods, the more pitiless becomes the struggle against an economic function which could hardly find economic justification except in a time of economic immobility, when the treasury of the usurer constituted an indispensable reserve for society. Now the peasant begins to sell his products and to pay his lord in money. The nobility, in order to satisfy its growing luxury requirements, is interested in freeing the peasantry and in everywhere replacing fixed rent in kind by rent in money. The transformation of rent in kind into money rent that takes place at first sporadically, then on a more or less national scale, presupposes an already more significant development of trade, urban industry, commodity production in general, and therefore monetary circulation. The transformation of all classes of society into producers of exchange values, into owners of money, raises them unanimously against Jewish usury, whose archaic character emphasizes its rapacity. The struggle against the Jews takes on increasingly violent forms. Royalty, traditional protector of the Jews, has to yield to the repeated demands of congresses of the nobility and the bourgeoisie. Besides, the monarchs themselves are increasingly compelled to dig into the treasuries of the bourgeoisie, a class which soon monopolizes the most important portion of mobile wealth. In the eyes of the kings, the Jews, as a source of revenue, become less interesting, leaving out of consideration the fact that expulsion of the Jews was always an extremely profitable operation. It is in this fashion that the Jews were progressively expelled from all the Western countries. It was an exodus from the more developed countries to the more backward ones of Eastern Europe. Poland, deeply mired in feudal chaos, became the principal refuge of Jews driven out of every other place. In other countries, in Germany, in Italy, the Jews still survived in the less developed regions. At the time of the travels of Benjamin of Tudela, there were practically no Jews in commercial centers such as Pisa, Amalfi, Genoa. On the other hand, they were very numerous in the most backward parts of Italy. Even in the Papal States, conditions were far superior for Jewish trade and banking than in the rich mercantile republics of Venice, Genoa, and Florence. Mercantile economy therefore expelled the Jews from their last strongholds. The Jew, banker to the nobility, was already completely unknown in Western Europe toward the end of the Middle Ages. Here and there, small Jewish communities succeeded in maintaining themselves in certain secondary economic functions. The Jewish banks were no longer anything but pawnshops where it is poverty which is the borrower. The collapse was a total one. The Jew became a petty usurer who lends to the poor of town and country against pledges of petty value. And what can he do with the securities which are not redeemed? He must sell them. The Jew became a petty peddler, a dealer in second-hand goods. Gone forever was his former splendor. Now begins the era of the ghettos and of the worst persecutions and humiliations. The picture of these unfortunates bearing the badge of the wheel in ridiculous costumes, paying taxes like beasts for passing through cities and across bridges, disgraced and rejected, has been implanted for a long time in the memory of the populations of Western and Central Europe. Relations of the Jews with other classes in society. The evolution of the social and economic situation of the Jews was a determining influence upon the relations between them and other social classes. In the era of their economic apogee, they are solicitously protected by kings and nobles. Their relations with the peasants are not of great importance. As against this, the relations of the Jews with the bourgeois class were hostile from the latter's very entry upon the historic scene. Eliminated from commerce, Jewish capital takes refuge solely in usury. This new situation brings about a change in the attitude of the nobility and royalty toward the Jews. The lords, finding themselves obliged to defend their threatened properties, often pass over to a pitiless struggle against the usurers who are ruining them. The kings continue to protect the Jews, but in reality they make use of the Jews to siphon off the resources of the country for their own profit. But so long as exchange economy has not yet penetrated into the rural sphere, the situation of the Jews still remains relatively tolerable. It is only when the countryside begins to be capitalized, when lords and peasants begin to produce more and more for the market, when money begins to conquer an increasingly wider field of action, that all classes in society find themselves in agreement in persecuting and expelling the Jews. The victory of an economy based on money is also the defeat of the former moneyman. Eliminated from their role as bankers to the nobility, some Jews still succeed in hanging on within pores of the economy. Becoming pawnbrokers, old clothes merchants, peddlers, and second-hand dealers, they eke out a miserable existence in dark ghettos, but of the hatred and disdain of the people. Increasingly the Jews come into contact only with the poor, the artisans and the peasants. And often the anger of the people, despoiled by the kings and the lords and compelled to pledge their last belongings among the Jews, turns against the walls of the ghetto. The lords and rich bourgeois who utilize the Jews in order further to exploit the people often take advantage of these riots to pillage the slaves of their treasury. A royalty and the Jews. When the enemy of the Jews, Gonzalo Matigas, offered the king of Castile 3 million pieces of gold on condition that he would expel the Jews, the bishop Don Gil replied to him, "The Jews are a treasure to the king, a veritable treasure. And you want to drive them out, you are then no less an enemy of the king than you are of the Jews." Again, in 1307, following upon a resolution of the Castilian priests against Jewish usury, the king prohibits raising any difficulties for the Jews. The Jews, states a decree on this subject, belong to the king to whom they pay taxes, and that is the reason why it is impossible to permit any limitation whatever on their economic life, because this would be prejudicial to the royal treasury. In Poland, royal protection took on unusual proportions in this epoch. Thus, in 1504, the Polish king, Alexander, declares that he acts towards the Jews as befits kings and the mighty, who should not distinguish themselves solely by their tolerance to Christians, but also to the followers of other religions. Another Polish monarch, King Casimir Jagiello, similarly states that he acts in accordance with the principle of tolerance imposed by divine law. The reason for this attitude is not difficult to understand. The Jews constituted a source of considerable revenue for the kings. For example, in Spain, it was Jewish financiers, the Ravia brothers, who made it possible for the Castilian kings to bring the war against the Moors to a successful conclusion. Other Jewish bankers supported the Spanish kings in their struggle against the nobility. A special fiscal organization, constituted for the collection of Jewish taxes, functioned in several countries. In England, the Scaccarium Judaeorum permitted the registration of all Jewish business affairs, and the recovery of loans was effected through its agency. It was directed by a committee of 7 members, 3 of whom were Jews, 2 Christians, and 2 appointees of the king. Each credit operation brought in 10% to the royal treasury. It goes without saying that royalty could not remain content with such a meager share. So appropriate measures, such as extraordinary confiscations, made up for the deficiency in normal taxes. Juridically, the Jews were Kommernkte, slaves of the royal treasury, and in countries where political power was extremely divided up, they were slaves of the treasuries of the lords. To fill the cash boxes of the mighty, this became the reason for existing. In Anglo-Saxon law it is stated, ipsi Judae et omnia sua regis sunt, that is to say, the Jews and all their property belong to the king. The law of North Spain is expressed in the same way, the Jews are slaves of the king and belong forever to the royal treasury. The system was one of grandiose simplicity. The Jews despoiled the lords and the kings fleeced the Jews. But in order to fleece them, it was essential to keep them there. That is why the kings protected the Jews and encouraged their ventures with all the means in the royal power. But while the king, in his capacity as representative of the state, was interested in protecting the Jews, we must not forget that he was, at the same time, a great lord and consequently one of their great debtors. In this role he was obviously tempted to put an end to their undertakings, which always constituted a fruitful operation. Whereas, on the part of the lords of lesser importance, the will to free themselves from their debts and to satisfy their greed was checkmated or restrained precisely by the protection which royalty accorded the Jews. The great king lord obviously had no such external barriers to surmount. 2 souls therefore inhabited his body. In his role as king, he fought the demands of nobility and the bourgeoisie and opposed the massacres and expulsions of the Jews. In his role as the greatest landed proprietor, he himself had the greatest interest in the persecutions directed against the Jews. The means which the kings could use in order to extract money from their Jewish slaves were very varied. First there was the mass arrest. The Jews were imprisoned under any pretext and were not liberated until they handed over rather large sums of money. By this method, in 1180, the King of France, Philip II, extorted 150,000 marks from the Jews. Count Alphonse of Poitiers on a similar occasion collected 20,000 pounds. Still other methods were available. The Jews were accused of poisoning wells and using the blood of Christians in their religious ceremonies, the ritual trial. In 1321, the Jews of France were fined 150,000 pounds for poisoning wells. Finally, the most successful operation of this kind consisted of expelling the Jews, confiscating their goods, and later readmitting them in consideration of the payment of enormous sums. In 1182, Philip Augustus throws all the Jews out of his kingdom and confiscates all their real property. He lets them return 15 years later and receives a gift of 150,000 marks for this act of charity. Again, in 1268, the King of France decrees that all Jews must leave France and their treasuries are to be confiscated. Soon after negotiations are begun with his Servicumari and the order is subsequently rescinded in consideration of substantial gifts. The expulsion of the Jews in 1306 brought the King of France £228,460, an enormous sum for the period. Invited anew to return in 1315, the Jews paid £22,500 for this new favor. But some 6 years later, they find themselves compelled again to take the path of exile. The history of the Jews of France and of Languedoc ends in 1394 by their definitive expulsion, accompanied by the usual sequel, confiscation of all their goods. These proceedings are not limited to France. In 1379, the Austrian princes imprison all the Jews found in their territories. The latter succeeded in getting free only at an enormous price. The same princes profited from anti-Jewish agitation among the peasants in 1387 by making the Jews pay 16,000 marks. The attitude of the kings and princes toward the Jews therefore appears somewhat contradictory. But it is determined in the last analysis by economic development. Wherever the Jews play an indispensable role in economic life, wherever exchange economy is only weakly developed, state interests impel the kings to protect the Jews, to defend them against all their enemies. Thus, in Poland, royalty always appears as their firmest protector. In the more developed countries, where usury is no longer anything but an anachronism, the kings have far fewer scruples about pillaging the Jews. Soon the sole important financial power will be that of the bourgeoisie, basing itself on the development of the economy, and in the eyes of the king the Jews will lose all interest. What are the Jewish bankers compared to financiers like the Fuggers, the Medicis? Here is what Schipper says in regard to the importance of these Jewish bankers. As regards the importance of the capital of the Jewish bankers of Italy, we have only found two really rich families among the Jewish capitalists. But what were they in comparison with such magnates as the Medicis who, around 1440, possessed 500,000 florins, or Agostino Chigi, who in 1520, left 800,000 ducats? Jewish bankers had at their disposal only several thousand florins. It goes without saying that under these conditions the Jews could no longer be of interest to the kings. The era of the great Jewish magnates who supported the royal power against its domestic and foreign enemies was definitely closed. The increasing expenditure which war imposed upon the state or the princes compelled the latter to find some new means of replenishing their treasuries, for now that bands of mercenaries and fleets were playing a greater part in warfare, it was becoming more costly than ever. The old sources of revenue were insufficient, consequently, the only thing to be done was to apply to the third estate, that is, to the cities, and to ask them to open their purses. The decline of the economic position of the Jews, produced by the capitalization of economy, resulted in the loss of the protection which the kings and princes had accorded them. The kings became actively associated in the persecutions and pillaging of the Jews. b. The nobility and the Jews. In the early Middle Ages, the Jews were indispensable to the nobles in their capacity as principal suppliers of Oriental products. Later on, the noble wastrel, living without foresight, needed the Jews as a money reserve always ready to satisfy his caprices. For many a powerful lord the Jew was, as he was for the kings, an important source of revenue. In the epoch when royalty had not yet asserted its complete authority over the nobility, frequent conflicts broke out between princes, lords, and kings for possession of the Jews. In the 12th century there was much talk about the suit between the Countess Blanche and King Philip Augustus over the Jew Cresselin who had fled from the domain of the Countess in order to take refuge in the lands of the king. After the manner of the kings, the barons appropriated the Jews. A baron would say my Jews just as he said my lands when he counted up his income. This property was in fact very remunerative. Thibaut, Count of Champagne, was as certain as King Philip of his property right over the Jews who lived in his domains. In 1198 the two concluded an agreement in which each promised not to detain the other's Jews. The practice of agreements on the subject of the Jews spreads rapidly in the 13th century. Instead of having to engage in long suits, the kings and princes agreed to surrender to each other the Jews who took refuge on their territories. Such an agreement reached in 1230 states that the king as well as the princes preserve their rights in the Jews who are like slaves, Judaeus damquam proprius servus. Later on, we see Jews put on the auction block after a fashion. Philip IV buys all the Jews of the county of Valois from his brother, the Count of Valois, after having had a suit against him concerning 43 Jews whose property he claimed. He also buys from him a Jew of Rouen who was good for £300 quarterly. Whereas the prince-electors have the right within their domains to exploit all mines of gold, silver, tin, iron as well as salt mines, therefore be it also granted them the right to admit and to possess Jews. This is the wording of a golden bull of the German emperor in the year 1356. Presently the German cities, prospering increasingly, will dispute the right to possess Jews with the kings and princes. Just as between royalty and the princes, so also an agreement will be reached with the cities which will thus acquire an important share of the profits accruing from the exploitation of the Jews. It goes without saying that all those who thus profited from Jewish usury could only be hostile to the conversion of the Jews to Christianity. So true is it that religion is only a reflection of an economic function, that conversion of Jews to Christianity automatically led to the abandonment of their profession by the converts. The conferences convoked by the new converts always led to violent conversions of a certain number of Jews, even if they did not win over the rabbis who participated in the discussions. This reached a point where the lords, and the bishops themselves, whose Jews were thus being taken from them and who were thus being deprived of the income which they received from them, complained to the king on a number of occasions. The bishop of Palencia, following a conference convoked by a converted Jew Jehu Damaska, a conference which had led to the conversion of a large number of Jews, prayed the king to come to his aid, in view of the fact that his resources were going to be greatly reduced. The English king, William II, who went so far as to farm out the revenues of vacant episcopal seats to the Jews, compelled converted Jews to return to Judaism in order not to lose the profits which he drew from them. In order to prevent the conversion of Jews, another English king, Henry II, decreed that the goods of Jews embracing Christianity would be attached by the crown, to make up for the losses in revenues that the Jews would have brought the king if they had not been converted. By this we can see the naivete of our idealist historians who imagine that all the efforts of Christianity were in the direction of converting the Jews and who believe that all the sufferings of the Jews must be explained by the resistance which they made to these efforts. So long as the economic function represented by Judaism was necessary, there was opposition to their religious assimilation, which also meant their economic assimilation. It is solely when Judaism became superfluous economically that it had to assimilate or disappear. It was, of course, only a tiny part of the nobility which profited from Jewish usury. For the majority of feudal lords, the Jew was a direct cause of their ruin. For the king or the prince to be able to despoil the Jews, it was necessary that the majority of the nobles should groan under the weight of their debts. Compelled thus to surrender to the Jews a portion of the surplus value which they extorted from the peasants, it was obvious that the nobles would endeavor to retake it from them at the first opportunity. The indebtedness of the nobles to the Jewish usurers contained the germs of bloody conflicts. In 1189, there were anti-Jewish excesses in a number of English cities, at London, Lincoln, etc. A year later occurred the tragedy of York. The indebted knights of the Yorkshire Jews, goaded on by a certain Malabes, attacked the Jews in the Scaccarium Judaeorum. The notes found in the Scaccarium were solemnly burned and the Jews who took refuge in the chateau were besieged. The affair ended by a mass suicide of the besieged Jews. The customary sequel was not lacking. The king took over the notes held by the suicides, since the Jews were the slaves of his treasury. The anti-Jewish massacres at London in 1264, which counted 550 victims, had also been organized by landed proprietors indebted to the Jews. The same was true about the anti-Jewish riots in other cities. Thus, at Canterbury it began by an attack against the Scaccarium Judaeorum. All over Europe assemblies of the nobility are unceasing in their protest against Jewish usury. Their various demands best characterize the position of the feudal lords to the Jews. In the second half of the 13th century the Castilian Cortes submit the three following demands to the king. Regulation of Jewish credit operations and limitations on the interest rates demanded by usurers. Proscription of hereditary rights in the possession of lands by Jews. A reform of the financial administration and elimination of Jewish functionaries and controllers. These will be the classical demands of the nobility in all the countries of Europe. They aim to limit the portion of surplus value that the nobility is compelled to turn over to the Jews, to prevent the latter from becoming landed proprietors and from seizing control of the state apparatus. It was not until the 14th century that the Spanish nobility achieved its first results in this sphere. In 1328 King Alphonse IX reduced the rate of interest to 25% and cancelled 1/4 of all Jewish credits. In 1371, there was another amputation of the credits. The occasions were not few in which the Aragon Cortes raised their voices against the high rate of interest paid to the Jews, notably in 1235, 1241, 1283, 1292, and 1300. The Cortes of Portugal complain of Jewish usury in 1361 as becoming an increasingly unbearable yoke upon the population. In the circles of the Spanish nobility and rich patrician class the Jews were hated because of their state functions, where they showed themselves to be servile instruments of royalty, as well as because of the great tax and impost farming by which the Jewish magnates unceasingly augmented their fortunes. In Poland also, the demands of the nobility and the clergy against Jewish usury became more and more pressing. An ecclesiastical congress, held in 1420, demanded measures by the king against great Jewish usury. In 1423, Vladislav Jagiello promulgated the Statute of Warda which forbade the Jews to lend on mortgages. In 1454, the Statute of Nassau limited the validity of Jewish credit to 3 years. The Sejms of the nobility succeeded in banning the Jews from access to state employment. The Polish nobility pursued the same objectives as the Spanish nobility: limitation of the interest rate, safeguarding of its properties, elimination of Jews from state employment. Political reasons join with economic causes for the hostility which the nobility nurses against the Jews. In 1469 the Cortes protest against the admission of Jews to tax farming and against the protection with which the kings surround them. Ritual trials and massacres come to the support of the pressures exerted by the nobility upon royalty. The Jews were, in fact, solid supports of royal absolutism which was above all directed against the nobility. The surplus value surrendered to the Jews by the nobles aided in forging their chains. The small barons hated the Jews as creditors, the great ones saw in them one of the principal financial resources on which the king's independence of them rested. The financial support furnished the kings by the Jews was indispensable to them in their struggle against the nobility as well as in their opposition to the growing demands of the cities. It was the Jews who first permitted the kings to maintain costly armies of mercenaries which began to take the place of the undisciplined hordes of the nobility. These armies first served foreign policy. Thus, in Spain, it was in large part Jewish finance which allowed the kings to defeat the Arabs. In 1263, the Jewish banker Yehuda de Cavalier loans the king of Aragon a great sum which permits him to equip a flotilla against the Arabs. In 1276, Cavalier amasses funds for an army which fights the Arabs at Valencia. But what is more serious in the eyes of the nobility and augments the list of its grievances is the support that the Jews furnish royalty in the struggle which it is conducting against the feudal lords. We have already spoken of the Ravia brothers who supplied the royal army with money and arms during the domestic wars which the king conducted against the insurgent nobles of Catalonia. The nobility could not forgive the Jews for that. The Ravia brothers fell victims of assassins as did so many of their successors. Generally speaking, the struggle of the nobility against the Jews was far less radical than that of the bourgeoisie. Different social contents influenced the intensity and forms of struggle of each class. Whereas the landed proprietor still had need of the usurer and sought simply to limit the field of his activity, the bourgeois and even the burgessified noble resented him more and more as an intolerable barrier. C. The bourgeoisie and the Jews. The commercial monopoly of the Jews was one of the greatest obstacles that the nascent bourgeoisie had to surmount. Destruction of the commercial domination of the Jews was the precondition for its own development. It was not a question of a struggle between two national or religious groups for commercial supremacy but a conflict between two classes each representing a different economic system. The apparent national competition is only a reflection here of the transition from feudal economy to exchange economy. The Jews ruled commerce in the epoch when the great proprietors bought works of refinement and objects of luxury of great price against large quantities of the raw materials from their lands. The industrial development of Western Europe put an end to their monopoly. In struggling against the Jews, the native traders were rising up against an outmoded economic function which appeared more and more as an intolerable exploitation of the country by foreigners. The relations of the merchant class with the Jews after the eviction of the latter from commerce underwent a profound modification. Jewish credit was essentially consumers' credit. It was not to the Jewish bankers that the traders had recourse for their business. Great banking houses like the Medicis, the Chigis, the Fuggers, developed in the great cities. Later, when exchange economy will have penetrated into the rural domains, the Jewish usurers will be crowded out by these great invading Christian banks. Just like pre-capitalist commerce, which exchange economy drives out of the cities, the usurer is dislodged by the penetration of capitalism into the feudal domain. Altogether different will be the position of the great merchants towards the Jews when the latter, upon the decline of their economic role, will no longer be anything but petty usurers lending to artisans and small shopkeepers. The Jew no longer appears in that period as a competitor of the rich trader or banker, he concerns them insofar as he is an interesting source of profit and insofar as he is a means for weakening the popular classes with whom he is engaged in continuous struggle. The great merchants will now dispute with the kings and lords for the Jews. It is above all in Germany that the cities pass over to a general offensive to take possession of the profits which the royal Jew procured for the princes. The royal Jew is increasingly divided up from the second half of the 13th century on. The German cities, already flourishing in this period, begin to demand a share of him also. Their determined struggle against the feudal lords had enabled them to conquer a series of liberties such as autonomous courts and the right of administration. They now turn their attention to the royal Jew, they strive to tear him out of the hands of the lords and of the emperor. The city of Cologne, in 1252, secures from its archbishop the right to a third of the taxes collected from the Jews in the city. The Bishop of Worms, in 1293, allows the city council to admit and to tax Jews. On March 7, 1456, the Bishop Burchard pawns the Jews of Halberstadt for 3 years with the council of this city. The royal Jew is conquered. By Mainz, in 1259. By Regensburg, at the end of the 13th century. By Nuremberg, in 1315. By Speyer in 1315. By Zurich, in 1335. By Frankfurt, in 1337. By Strasbourg, in 1338, etc. The struggle of these three forces, the nobility, the emperor, and the cities ends up in a compromise upon the backs of the Jews. They will pay to the emperor a normal tax. In 1240 the Jews paid 1/5. A gold pfennig which every Jew or Jewess possessing more than 20 gulden had to pay to the nobility. An annual tax. An extraordinary tax to the cities. A special tax, the amount of which is set for each Jew, at the time when he receives his letter of citizenship, Bürgerbrief. Numerous taxes and extraordinary imposts were added to those listed above. Methods similar to those which we have encountered in other European countries were employed to extort as much money from the Jews as possible. Popular and peasant riots similarly constituted unique occasions for getting lush payments from the Jews for the protection that was granted them. The growth of the power of the cities augmented their power over the Jews. In 1352, according to an authorization by the emperor to the city of Speyer, the Jews inhabiting our city will belong to us exclusively, will be our property in body and goods. An agreement of 1352 stipulates that the city of Frankfurt must pay the emperor half of the profits that it collects from the Jews. At Nuremberg, the emperor's share rose as high as 2/3. The class struggle having as its object the division of the profits derived from the exploitation of the Jews, often turned against the latter. The Bishop of Cologne, states a chronicle of this city, wished to have a perpetual monopoly of the profits from the royal Jew. That is the reason why the Jews were driven out of this city forever. The Jews of the emperors were badly treated by the princes, those of the princes by the bourgeoisie. Relations of the Jews with the artisans and peasants. In the measure that usury became the principal occupation of the Jews, they entered increasingly into relations with the popular masses, and these relations worsen all the time. It was not luxury needs but the direst distress which forced the peasant or the artisan to borrow from the Jewish usurer. They pawned their working tools, which were often indispensable to assure their livelihood. It is easy to understand the hatred that the man of the people must have felt for the Jew in whom he saw the direct cause of his ruin, without perceiving the emperor, the prince, or the rich bourgeois, who became richer thanks to the Jewish usurer. It is in Germany above all where Jewish usury took on its most popular form, principally in the 14th and 15th centuries, that the hatred of the Jews manifested itself most, a hatred which ended in anti-Jewish massacres and in the burning of Jews, Judenbrand. Many instances of Jewish persecutions in the Middle Ages were first and foremost efforts to destroy the letters of credit which were in their possession and are, therefore, to be viewed as a barbarous method of meeting a financial crisis, as a medieval form of what we of the present time would call a social revolution. The first large-scale riots against the Jews took place between 1336 and 1338. They were led by the publican Cimberlin, the king of the poor, and from Alsace they spread into Bavaria, Austria, and Bohemia. But it was above all during the years of the Black Death, between 1348 and 1350, that fanaticism joined with hatred and made terrifying ravages. At Strasbourg, it was the guilds that preached annihilation of the Jews. But the city council, on which sat a patrician majority which drew large profits from usury, refused to give its consent. Bourgeois such as Conrad von Winterberg, the rich Sturm, and the wealthy artisan Schwarber, made speeches in favor of the Jews. Nevertheless, the guilds did not abandon their anti-Jewish demands. The matter was finally left to a congress which was to meet in 1343 and in which representatives of the church, the nobility, and the cities were to take part. The demands of the guilds were supported by the church and by the lords, who were anxious to rid themselves of their debts. Following this, the Jews were declared outside the pale of the law and the burning of Jews spread throughout Alsace. At Mainz and at Cologne, the patricians tried to protect the Jews but were submerged by the popular wave. A city chronicle of Augsburg relates the following: in 1384, the bourgeois of Nedlingen, having massacred all the Jews of Nedlingen, took possession of their goods. The debtors of the Jews, among them the Count of Aingen, were freed of their debts. The pledges and notes of the Count were returned to him. All this was done by the mob against the will of the city council. The peasant revolts were accompanied by massacres of Jews. In 1431, the armed peasants of the Pfalz marched against Worms and demanded that the city council hand over the Jews to them, in view of the fact that they had ruined them and taken away their last shirt. The council opposed these demands since its members were the ones who profited most from Jewish usury. The lords entered into negotiations with the council in order to obtain the cancellation of accumulated interest bearing down upon the impoverished peasants. The anti-Jewish riots in Catalonia and in the Balearic Islands bear the same character. The peasants, living in great poverty and heavily indebted to the Jews because of the burden of taxes, revolt in order to free themselves from their debts. They burn the judicial archives. 4. The Jews in Europe after the Renaissance. A. The Jews in Western Europe after the Renaissance. The thesis of Sombart. The discovery of the New World and the tremendous current of exchange that followed upon it sounded the death knell of the old corporative feudal world. Mercantile economy reached a higher stage, smashing the remnants of previous periods and preparing, by the development of manufacture and rural industry, the basis of industrial capitalism. The place of the old centers of corporative industry and medieval trade, fallen into decay, was taken over by Antwerp, which became the commercial center of the world for a certain period. Everywhere, although at different times and in different forms, the decline of the economy producing use values was accompanied by the decay of the economic and social function of the Jews. An important number of the Jews was compelled to leave the countries of Western Europe in order to seek refuge in the countries where capitalism had not yet penetrated, principally in Eastern Europe and in Turkey. Others became assimilated, fused with the Christian population. This assimilation was not always easy. Religious traditions long survived the social situation which had been their foundation. For centuries the Inquisition struggled mercilessly and barbarously against Jewish traditions which persisted among the mass of converts. The Jews who penetrated into the merchant class acquired a certain notoriety under the name of New Christians, principally in America and also at Bordeaux and Antwerp. In the first half of the 17th century, all the great sugar plantations in Brazil were in the hands of Jews. By the decree of March 2, 1768, all registers concerning New Christians were destroyed. By the law of March 24, 1773, New Christians were made equal before the law with Old Christians. In 1730, Jews possessed 115 plantations out of 344 at Suriname. But contrary to previous epochs, the activity of the Jews in America no longer had a special economic character. It was in no ways distinguished from the activity of Christians. The new Christian merchant was little different from the old Christian merchant. The same was true of the Jewish plantation owner. And this is also the reason why juridical, religious, and political distinctions rapidly disappeared. In the 19th century, the Jews in South America no longer constituted more than a handful. Assimilation of the Jews proceeded just as rapidly in France and in England. The rich merchant Jews of Bordeaux, of whom it was said that they possessed entire streets and had large trade, felt themselves completely integrated into the Christian population. Those who are acquainted with the Portuguese Jews of France, Holland, England, know that they are far from having an unconquerable hatred for all the peoples who surround them, as Mr. Voltaire says, but on the contrary they believe themselves so identified with these peoples that they consider themselves a part of them. Their Portuguese or Spanish origin has become a pure ecclesiastical discipline. The assimilated Jews of the West acknowledged no relationship with the Jews still living under the conditions of feudal life. A Jew of London as little resembles a Jew of Constantinople as the latter does a Chinese Mandarin. A Portuguese Jew of Bordeaux and a German Jew of Metz have nothing in common. Mr. Voltaire cannot ignore the delicate scruples of the Portuguese and Spanish Jews in not mixing with the Jews of other nations, either by marriage or otherwise. Alongside the Spanish, French, Dutch, and English Jews, whose complete assimilation is proceeding slowly and surely, we still find Jews in Western Europe, primarily in Italy and in Germany, who inhabit ghettos and are mostly petty usurers and peddlers. This is a sorry remnant of the former Jewish merchant class. They are reviled, persecuted, subject to innumerable restrictions. It was on the special basis of the rather important economic role played by the first category of Jews that Sombart presented his famous thesis on the Jews and economic life. He has himself summarized it in these terms: the Jews promote the economic flowering of countries and cities in which they settle, they lead the countries and cities which they abandon to economic decay. They are the founders of modern capitalism. There would be no modern capitalism, no modern culture without the dispersion of the Jews in the countries of the North. Israel passes over Europe like the sun, at its coming new life bursts forth, at its going all falls into decay. This is the way, in rather poetic fashion as we can see, that Sombart presents his thesis. And here are the proofs adduced in its support. The first event to be recalled, an event of worldwide import, is the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, 1492, and from Portugal, 1495 and 1497. It should never be forgotten that on the day before Columbus set sail from Palos to discover America, August 3, 1492, 300,000 Jews are said to have emigrated from Spain. In the 15th century, the Jews were expelled from the most important commercial cities of Germany, Cologne, 1424-25, Augsburg, 1439-40, Strasbourg, 1438, Erfurt, 1458, Nuremberg, 1498-99, Ulm, 1499, Regensburg, 1519. In the 16th century, the same fate befell them in a number of Italian cities. They were driven out of Sicily in 1492, from Naples in 1540-41, from Genoa and Venice in 1550. Here as well the decline of these cities coincides with the departure of the Jews. The economic development of Holland at the end of the 16th century is marked by a great rise of capitalism. The first Portuguese Marranos settled at Amsterdam in 1593. The brief flowering of Antwerp as the center of world trade and as a world exchange coincides exactly with the arrival and departure of Marranos. These arguments, essential to the Zombert thesis, are very easily refuted. 1. It is absurd to see in the simultaneity of the departure of Christopher Columbus to discover America and the expulsion of the Spanish Jews a proof of the decline of the countries which they left. Not only did Spain and Portugal not fall into decline in the 16th century, under Charles V and Emmanuel, but on the contrary they reached their historical apogee at that time. Even at the beginning of the reign of Philip II, Spain is still the foremost power in Europe and the wealth of Mexico and Peru which flowed to it was immeasurable. This first Zombardist proof is based on a crying falsehood. 2. The very figures which he supplies on the redistribution of the Jewish refugees coming from Spain aids in demolishing his thesis. According to him, out of 165,000 exiles, 122,000 or 72% emigrated to Turkey and into Muslim countries. Consequently, it is there that the capitalist spirit of the Jews should have produced the most important effects. Is it necessary to add then, that while we can speak of a certain economic rise in the Turkish Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent, that country remained the least accessible to capitalism up to a very recent period, so that the rays of the sun there proved to be very cold? It is true that a rather important number of Jews, 25,000, settled in Holland, at Hamburg, and in England, but can we concede that the same cause produced diametrically opposite effects? 3. The coincidence which Sombart perceives in the decline of the German cities is easily explained by reversing the causal relation. The ruin of these cities was not provoked by the measures taken against the Jews, these measures were on the contrary the effect of the decline of these cities. On the other hand, the prosperity of other cities was not the result of Jewish immigration but it was the latter which naturally directed itself toward prosperous cities. It is obvious that the relation of cause and effect is contrary to that presented by Zombart. A study of the economic role of the Jews in Italy and Germany at the end of the 15th and 16th centuries fully confirms this viewpoint. It is clear that the pawnshops, the business of Jewish usurers, were endurable so long as the economic situation of these cities was relatively good. Every worsening of the situation rendered the burden of usury more intolerable and the anger of the population vented itself first of all against the Jews. 4. The example of Holland does not, it is true, weaken the thesis of Zombart but neither does it reinforce it. Even if we admit that its prosperity was favored by the arrival of the Marranos, we are not thereby authorized to make it its cause. And how can we explain, if we base ourselves on this criterion, the decline of Holland in the 18th century? It appears, moreover, that the economic role of the Jews in Holland is exaggerated. Sayus says, in connection with the Dutch East India Company, whose importance to the prosperity of Holland was decisive, the Jews have in any case no role whatsoever in the formation of the first genuinely modern stock corporation, the Dutch East India Company. They subscribed barely 0.1% of its capital and played no important role in its activity during the ensuing years. Is it necessary to continue? Must it be shown that the important economic development of England took place precisely after the expulsion of the Jews? If the causal relation established by Zombart were true, how explain that in Russia and in Poland, where the southern people from the desert have been most numerous for centuries, their influence on the northern peoples produced no economic flowering whatever? The theory of Zombart is consequently completely false. Zombart claims that he is portraying the economic role of the Jews, but he does so in a completely impressionistic way, rearranging history to suit his theory. Zombart presents a thesis on the Jews and economic life in general, but deals solely with a very limited part of their history. Zombart builds a theory on the Jews in general and on economic life, but he limits himself to a minority of Western Jews, of Jews on the road to complete assimilation. In reality, even if the role of the Western Jews had been such a somber presence, he would still have had to make an abstraction from it in order to understand the Jewish question in the present period. Without the influx of Eastern Jews into Western Europe in the 19th century, the Western Jews would long ago have been absorbed in the surrounding milieu. One more observation regarding the theory of Sombart: if the Jews constituted such an economic boon, if their departure provoked the economic decay of cities and countries, how explain their continuous persecution in the late Middle Ages? Can this be explained by religion? But then, why was the position of the Jews so solid in Western Europe in the early Middle Ages and in Eastern Europe up to the 19th century? How explain the prosperity of the Jews for long centuries in the most backward countries of Europe, in Poland, in Lithuania, the powerful protection accorded them by the kings? Can the difference in the situation of the Jews be explained by the difference in the intensity of religious fanaticism? But then how can we concede that religious fanaticism should be most intense precisely in the most developed countries? How can we explain that it was precisely in the 19th century that anti-Semitism developed most strongly in Poland? The question then is to seek the causes for the existence of differences in the intensity of religious fanaticism. And thus we are brought back to the duty of studying economic phenomena. Religion explains anti-Jewish persecutions like a soporific explains sleep. If the Jews had really played the role that Sombart attributes to them, it would be very difficult to understand why the development of capitalism was such a mortal blow to them. It is consequently inaccurate to regard the Jews as founders of modern capitalism. The Jews certainly contributed to the development of exchange economy in Europe, but their specific economic role ends precisely where modern capitalism starts. B. The Jews in Eastern Europe up to the 19th century. At the dawn of the development of industrial capitalism, Western Judaism was on the road to disappearance. The French Revolution, by destroying the last juridical obstacles which stood in the way of assimilation of the Jews, only gave sanction to an already existing situation. But it is certainly not by chance that at the same time that the Jewish question was being extinguished in the West, it rebounded with redoubled violence in Eastern Europe. In the period when the Jews in Western Europe were being massacred and burned, a large number of Jews had sought refuge in the countries where capitalism had still not penetrated. At the beginning of the 19th century, the immense majority of Jews inhabited the east of Europe, principally the former territory of the monarchist Republic of Poland. In this paradise of a carefree Szlachta, petty nobility, the Jewish commercial class had found a large field of activity. For long centuries, the Jew was a merchant, usurer, publican, steward to the noble, an agent for everything. The small Jewish cities, submerged in a sea of peasant villages, often themselves adjoining the chateau of the Polish feudal lords, represented exchange economy within a purely feudal society. The Jews were situated, as Marx states, in the pores of Polish society. This situation lasted as long as the social and political organization of Poland remained static. In the 18th century, following upon political confusion and economic decay, Polish feudalism found itself fatally stricken. Along with it, the secular position of the Jews in Eastern Europe was shaken to its foundations. The Jewish problem, close to vanishing in the West, flared up violently in Eastern Europe. The flame, close to extinction in the West, received renewed vitality from the conflagration which arose in the East. The destruction of the economic position of the Jews in Eastern Europe will have as a consequence a massive emigration of Jews into the world. And everywhere, although in different forms and under different guises, the flood of Jewish immigrants coming from Eastern Europe will revitalize the Jewish problem. It is in this respect that the history of the Jews of Eastern Europe has certainly been the decisive factor in the Jewish question in our epoch. The commercial relations of the Jews of Eastern Europe, of Bohemia, Poland, and Little Russia, date from the Carolingian era. The trading circuit that the Jews had established during the early Middle Ages between Asia and Europe became extended in this way across the fields of Poland and the plains of the Ukraine. Like their coreligionists, the Radomites, the Eastern Jews exchanged the precious products of Asia, spices and silks, for the raw materials of Europe. They constituted the sole commercial element in a purely agricultural society. In the Carolingian era, the economic regime of all Europe being practically the same, the role of Eastern Judaism was similar to that of Western Judaism. It is only later that their history will enter upon completely different paths. Accounts of the travels of Ibrahim ibn Jacob, 965, testify to the considerable development of Jewish trade at Prague in the 10th century. The Jews came there from the Far East and from Byzantium, bringing different kinds of precious merchandise and Byzantine money, and there bought wheat, tin, and furs. In a document of 1090, the Jews of Prague are depicted as traders and money changers, possessing large sums of silver and gold. They are depicted as the richest merchants among all peoples. Jewish slave merchants, as well as other Jewish traders coming from the Far East and traversing the frontier in caravans, are also mentioned in documents of 1124 and 1226. The interest rate among the Jewish bankers of Prague, whose operations were very extensive, fluctuated between 108 and 180%. The chronicler Gallus states that in 1085, Judith, the wife of Prince Ladislav Herman of Poland, strove to buy back some Christian slaves from Jewish merchants. Excavations undertaken in the past century have helped bring to light the great economic importance of the Jews in Poland in this period. Polish money has been discovered bearing Hebraic characters and dating from the 12th and 13th centuries. This fact in itself proves that Polish trade was in the hands of the Jews. The Tatar invasions of the 13th century must certainly have had some influence on the Russian and Polish Jews, but as early as 1327, there is a privilege conferred by the Polish king, Władysław Lokitek, involving Hungarian Jewish merchants coming to Krakow. Far from diminishing, Jewish trade in Poland only takes some greater extension in the course of succeeding centuries. Just as in Western Europe, development of trade went together with an expansion of usury. Here also, the nobility, principal client of the Jewish usurers, strove to obtain restrictions on Jewish usury as against the kings who favored it for the Jews. In their capacity as slaves of the treasury must always have money ready for our service. In the same of 1347, the nobility, desiring to limit the interest rate which had reached 108%, collided with the firm resistance of royalty. In 1456, King Casimir Jagiello proclaims that in protecting the Jews he is inspired by the principle of tolerance which is imposed upon him by divine law. In 1504, the Polish king, Alexander, declares that he acts towards the Jews as befits kings and the powerful who distinguish themselves not only by tolerance towards worshippers of the Christian religion but also towards the adherents of other religions. Under such auspices, the affairs of Jews could not help but prosper. In the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, Jewish usurers succeeded in taking possession of a portion of the lands belonging to the nobles. In 1389, the Jew Sabbatai becomes proprietor of a section of the Kailao domain. In 1390, the Krakow Jew Osman receives the property of Prince Dewis of Sligo as security. In 1393, the Posen Jew Moszczko takes possession of the Ponix Manor. In 1397, the lands of the Abijes Manor are pledged with the Posen Jew Abraham. These lands of the nobles are allotted to the Jews with complete property rights. Thus, in the last cited example, the noble having attacked the possessions transmitted to Abraham, the tribunal confirms the right of possession of the Jew and punishes the aggressor with a heavy fine. In 1404, the verdict of a tribunal declares that 3 villages pledged with the Jew Merlin of Krakow are transmitted to him with complete property rights and forever, cum omnibus juribus utilitatibus dominio, etc. in perpetuum. The most important bankers lived in Krakow, residence of the kings. Their principal debtors were in effect the kings, the princes, the voivode, governors, and the archbishops. Thus Casimir the Great borrowed the enormous sum of 15,000 marks from Jewish bankers. King Louis of Hungary owed the usurer Levko of Krakow 30,000 gulden at one time, 3,000 gulden at another. King Władysław Jagiello and the Queen, Jadwiga, also owed him substantial sums. Levko was not only a great banker, he was also a wholesale farmer for the kingdom. He leased the mint and coined its money, and the salt mines of the Elichka and of Bochnia were also farmed out to him. He owned houses at Krakow, as well as a brewery. Just like the great patricians, he was honored with the title of Virdus Gradus. The usury of the great Jewish bankers such as Mieszko, Jordan of Posen, and Aaron, who succeeded in amassing immense properties and took possession of villages and lands, raised a storm of protest among the nobility. The Statute of Warda, 1423, greatly restricted Jewish usury. Thus, in 1432, the Jew Alexander, with whom the villages Dąbrówka and Sokolo and a part of their living inventory had been pledged, was forced to return these properties to his debtor by decision of the tribunal, the Statute of Warda having proscribed loans on real property. The Jews and the kings did not readily resign themselves to this situation. A fierce struggle enabled them to abolish the Statute of Warda. The bankers were able to expand their sphere of operation. Thus, in 1444, The king pledged his palace at Lemberg to the banker Schiene. This usurer also had among his clients Prince Swittergiela, the voivode Krikska, who had pledged the village of Winiki with him, etc. But neither did the nobility accept defeat. It returned continuously to the charge and succeeded in forcing the king to promulgate the Statute of Nisawa in 1454, with harsher provisions than the Statute of Warda. Nevertheless, and this fact is sufficient to show the fundamental difference which existed in this sphere between Poland and Western Europe, the most draconian laws were not able to end Jewish usury. Starting with 1455, we even witness a rebirth of the banking trade mainly as a result of the immigration of Jews from Moravia and Silesia, as well as from other countries. From 1460 on, the records of Krakow testified to such an extensive revival of usurious transactions that this period is reminiscent of the Epic of Levko and of Schmerlin. The richest banker is a certain Fischl who had married the female banker Roszka of Prague and who furnished funds to the Polish king, Casimir Jagiello, as well as to his sons, the future kings Albrecht and Alexander. Whereas the nobility of Western Europe, thanks to the penetration of exchange economy into an abundance of money, succeeded in ridding itself everywhere of Jewish usury. The persistence of feudal economy in Eastern Europe made the nobility powerless on this terrain. Jewish banking survived all proscriptions. The backward state of the country also fettered the evolution which we have observed in the countries of Western Europe, the eviction of Jews from commerce and their confinement within usury. The bourgeois class and the cities were only beginning to develop. The struggle of the bourgeoisie against the Jews remained in an embryonic state and did not achieve any decisive results. The artisans, oppressed by Jewish usury, joined ranks with the traders. Here also, the sooner a province developed, the sooner arose conflicts with the Jews. In 1403, at Krakow, and in 1445 at Bochnia, artisans incite massacres of Jews. But the struggles were only episodic and nowhere ended with the elimination of the Jewish element. On the contrary, in the 16th and 17th centuries, their situation is only strengthened and Jewish commerce continues to flourish. In the second half of the 14th century, we hear of a syndicate of 3 Lemberg Jews, Shlomo, Zuya, and Jacob, formed with a view to furnishing Italian merchandise to the city council of Lemberg. At the beginning of the 15th century, Jews are provisioners of the royal court. In 1456, the Starosta of Kamieniec Podolski confiscates Oriental merchandise worth 600 marks from Jewish merchants coming to Poland from the commercial centers of the Black Sea. The Byzantine and Italian Jews of Kappa made numerous trips to Poland. The Jew Caliph Judaeus of Kappa passed great quantities of Oriental goods through the custom house of Lemberg. Even after the destruction of the Italian colonies in the Black Sea, 1475, the Jews continued to maintain relations with the Orient. From 1467 on, the Jew David of Constantinople regularly supplied Lemberg with Oriental goods. There is even mention of a renewal of the slave trade in Little Russia from 1440 to 1450. Russian law books recount an interesting fact. In 1449, a slave belonging to a Jew Mordecai of Galicia having fled, his owner sues in the courts for his return. The Jewish merchants of Kappa and Constantinople came only to the great fairs of Lemberg and Lublin. To these also came the Jews dispersed throughout the Russian and Polish cities and market towns in order to purchase Oriental goods and spread them throughout the districts which they inhabited. These Jewish merchants traveled the roads running from Lemberg and Lublin through Little and Greater Poland up to the Silesian frontier. The Jews also crossed this frontier and conducted a very lively trade with Bohemia and Germany. Letters from 1588 inform us that hides and furs were brought from Krakow to Prague and that money was loaned at interest and against pledges. The Fair of Lublin served as the commercial meeting place between the Jewish merchants of Poland and of Lithuania. The Jewish merchants exported hides, furs, timber, honey from Lithuania, and at the Lublin Fair they bought spices coming from Turkey and manufactured goods originating in Western Europe. Records of the city of Danzig mention Jewish merchants from Lithuania who exported timber, wax, fins, hides, etc., during the period 1423 to 1436. The position of Lithuanian Judaism was still more favorable than that of the Polish Jews. Until the Union of Lublin, Union of Poland and Lithuania, the Lithuanian Jews enjoyed the same rights as the entire free population. In their hands lay big business, banking, the custom houses, etc. The farming of taxes and customs brought them great wealth. Their clothes glittered with gold and they wore swords just like the gentry. Records of the Lithuanian chancellery show that in the period from 1463 to 1494 the Jews had leased almost all the customs offices of the Duchy of Lithuania, Bialik, Bryansk, Brzezinski, Grodno, Kiev, Minsk, Novgorod, Vitamin. Some documents from the years 1488 and 1489 mention certain Jews of Trach and of Kiev as exploiting the Grand Duke's salt mines. In the same period, we begin to meet Jews in the role of publicans, a profession which in the Polish and Little Russian village goes hand in hand with the trade of usury. The strengthening of the anarchy of the nobles in Poland necessarily affected the situation of the Jews. In the 16th century, their position remains very solid, but they pass more and more from royal control to that of the large and small feudal lords. The decline of the royal power makes its protection less effective, and the Jews themselves seek less brilliant but surer protectors. King Sigismund complains to the Sejm of 1539, "The aristocracy of our kingdom wants to monopolize all the profits of the Jews inhabiting the market towns, villages, and manors. It demands the right to judge them." To that we reply, if the Jews themselves resign the privileges of an autonomous jurisdiction which the kings our forefathers granted them and which have also been confirmed by us, they do in fact abandon our protection, and no longer drawing profit from them, we have no reason whatever to impose our kindnesses on them by force. It is obvious that if the Jews now decline these kindnesses, it was because royalty no longer had any degree of real power in this country dominated by the nobles. In the 16th century the situation of the Jews became stronger. They received anew all the rights against which attempts had been made in the preceding century. Their economic position improved. The growing power of the nobility, Poland became an electoral kingdom in 1569, deprived them of the protection of the kings, but the feudal lords did everything to stimulate their economic activity. The traders, lenders at interest, stewards of the noble manors, with their inns and breweries, were extremely useful to the feudal lords who passed their time abroad in luxury and idleness. The small towns located on the estates of the nobility were full of shops, of inns, of eating and drinking places, as well as of artisans. The Jew enjoyed absolute freedom if he only succeeded in ingratiating himself into the favor of his lord or poritz. The economic situation of the Jews was in general very good, but their subordinate position to the nobility sapped the basis of the highly developed Jewish autonomy which had existed in Poland. Circumstances were such at that time that the Jews of Poland could form a state within a state. With their special religious, administrative, and juridical institutions, the Jews constituted a special class there enjoying a special internal autonomy. A decree of Sigismund August, 1551, established the following basis for the autonomy of the Jews of Great Poland. The Jews had the right to choose, upon general agreement among themselves, rabbis and judges who were to administer them. The coercive power of the state could be put at their disposal. Each Jewish city or market town had a community council. In large centers, the community council consisted of 40 members, in small ones, of 10 members. The members of this council were elected by a system of double voting. The activity of the council was very extensive. It had to raise taxes, administer the schools, institutions, decide economic questions, engage in administering justice. The power of each council, called a Kahal, extended to the Jews of the surrounding villages. The councils of the large cities had authority over the small communities. In this way community unions were created, the Galil. We have already spoken of the Vod Arba Ratzoth, which was the General Assembly of the Jewish Councils of Poland, of 4 countries, Great Poland, Little Poland, Krakow, Podolia, Galicia Lemberg, and Volhynia, which met at regular intervals and constituted a veritable parliament. In the 17th century the foundations of Jewish autonomy began to rock. This coincided with the worsening of the situation of Polish Judaism as it began to feel the disagreeable effects of the anarchy that Polish feudal society was passing through. The partial change in the situation of the Jews, arising from the lessening of royal authority, had as result the placing of the Jews in greater contact than previously with the great mass of the bonded population. The Jew, becoming the steward of the noble or a publican, was hated by the peasants equally with or even more than the lords, because he was the one who became the principal instrument for their exploitation. This situation soon led to terrible social explosions, above all in the Ukraine, where the authority of the Polish nobility was weaker than in Poland. The existence of vast steppes permitted the formation of Cossack military colonies where fleeing peasants could prepare their hour of vengeance. The Jewish steward strove to draw as much as possible from the manors and to exploit the peasant as much as possible. The Little Russian peasant bore a deep hatred for the Polish landed proprietor, in his double role as foreigner and noble. But he hated even more, perhaps, The Jewish steward with whom he was in continuous contact and in whom he saw at one and the same time the detestable representative of the Lord and a non-Christian who was foreign to him both by his religion and his way of life. The tremendous Cossack revolt of Chmielnicki in 1648 results in completely erasing 700 Jewish communities from the face of the earth. At the same time, the revolt demonstrates the extreme feebleness of the anarchic Polish kingdom and prepares its dismemberment. From 1648 on, Poland never ceases to be the prey to invasions and domestic troubles. With the end of the old feudal state of things in Poland, the privileged position of Judaism is likewise finished. Massacres decimate it. The anarchy which rules the country makes any normal economic activity impossible. The worsening of the situation of the Jews weakens the old ideological basis of Judaism. Poverty and persecution create a propitious terrain for the development of mysticism. Study of the Kabbalah begins to replace that of the Talmud. Messianic movements like that of Sabbatai Zebi take on a certain dimension. It is also interesting to recall the conversion of Frank and his adherents to Christianity. The Frankists demanded that they be given a special territory because they did not want to exploit the peasants and live from usury and the exploitation of taverns. They preferred to work the land. These movements did not take on very great dimensions because the position of Judaism was not as yet definitely compromised. It is only toward the close of the 18th century that Polish feudal society really begins to cave in under the combined blows of internal anarchy, economic decay, and foreign intervention. It is then that the problems of emigration and of passing over to other professions, productivization, begin to be posed for Judaism.